All those who are holding tickets outside will get in as fast as they can. I'm speaking out to you, ladies and gentlemen, I'm speaking to the crowd on the outside, who seem to be standing rather reluctant to come in, and we're going to start this very soon.
Welcome back to Worthy. I'm Ben.
And I'm John.
And on this episode, we are talking about the 1978 Best Picture winner, The Deer Hunter, the winner of the 51st Academy Awards Best Picture. So in 1978, The Deer Hunter held a mirror to America, asking us to confront the psychological cost of war, not just for the soldiers on the battlefield, but also for the communities that they return to. It's a film that dives deep into the themes of trauma, friendship, and how war can change the course of an entire community. But how does a country heal from a conflict like Vietnam? What toll does war take on those who fight it and for those who wait at home? And how do we reconcile moments of beauty and camaraderie with the brutality of survival? And it's themes like that. It's these questions that we have about not just trauma in film, but specifically war and violence on film. And then this like return to normalcy. And it's this dichotomy that jumps off the screen because it is so visceral from one frame to the next, where it's a full-out war scene of blood and guts and lots of screaming to then these peaceful landscapes and what's going on back home. So John and I, we were going to look at sort of comparing where we've seen some of this before with previous Best Picture winners. So John, give us a few examples of war that we've seen in Best Picture winners before and sort of how those then tie into what The Deer Hunter is about.
So when you look back at 1953's From Here to Eternity, it's a film set on the very early days of World War II, before the war even starts. It's right around the Pearl Harbor attack. That's kind of like the culmination of our film, From Here to Eternity. But it also focuses on the stress, the kind of pressure that military life puts on you as a soldier, as well as the people around you, like the partners that you see in From Here to Eternity. So that was from 1953. So it is over 20 years previous from our film, The Deer Hunter, today. But if you go back even further, I think there's even other films that won Best Picture that are even closely more aligned to The Deer Hunter. Something like The Best Years of Our Lives, which is post-World War II, a film that kind of looks at the physical injuries, the civilian life coming back from a war, and it's what it's like to really deal with those psychological scars. I think that's really mirrors The Deer Hunter in a lot of ways, where it shows you the war itself, as well as coming home and feeling alienated from the rest of your community that wasn't at war. And then when you go back even further, way back to 1930 with All Quiet on the Western Front, you look at a Best Picture winner that is very much an anti-war film. It's showcasing World War I and the PTSD that you kind of received from being a soldier on the battlefield, and how even the Germans, as we look at as Americans as the enemy of World War I, even they were, disillusioned by the war and the experience that they had. So I feel like All Quiet on the Western Front, and specifically The Best Years of Our Lives, are two perfect comparisons and analogies to this film, because they both hit on that, the psychological impact that you receive from war, as well as the visceral violence that you see in war, and how those two kind of reflect. And then we jump all the way to 1978 with The Deer Hunter, and it's almost like a mixture of those two films. It is very similar to All Quiet on the Western Front, where you see the war itself, but you also see the beginnings. You see what it's like for these men who have this sense of camaraderie, this friendship that they have. They're all kind of outcasts that have become a family. So that kind of is not seen in those films. It adds a more personal dynamic. But Ben, what do you think about comparison like All Quiet on the Western Front or The Best Years of Our Lives?
Yeah, I agree with you that The Deer Hunter is a mix of those two, whereas you get in All Quiet on the Western Front this beginning, this before the war, what these guys were like. It's very small in comparison to The Deer Hunter, which we'll get to. And then you get this post effect with The Best Years of Our Lives, where now we're coming home, we're seeing exactly what they're all dealing with, and so The Deer Hunter takes that, has a character who's injured and loses limbs and is now disabled and has to function within this new world. You have characters with PTSD and the trauma and can't really feel like a distance with the community that they're a part of. So you see that within those two of All Quiet on the Western Front, Best Years of Our Lives, then combining into The Deer Hunter. But it still feels like The Deer Hunter does it in a way that is more effective and more real to today. Because it felt like with All Quiet on the Western Front, Best Years of Our Lives, you can feel sympathetic, but it's sort of like that 30s, 40s melodrama like filter over it, which is good. And we love those movies, but it feels like with this one, it's a little more like, whoa, makes your eyes, widen a little bit more. And you're kind of like really taken aback by like what you are seeing with what the guys in Deer Hunter are dealing with. You can literally see the trauma that they're, experiencing, like what is happening to make them then feel this way. And I feel like you're then carrying that with you throughout the rest of the film while watching it. And you're sort of having your own like PTSD and like weird feelings with, the war and what you just saw. And then seeing this like, just, back to normal life, that they have in this hometown of theirs. So it's really fascinating. And it's something I think we're going to hit on throughout, because I think that's just kind of what the main conflict is. And the central theme of this film is like what happens when you go to war and then coming back, the before and after. What does that look like within these group of people?
So Ben, there's no better time to ask, is The Deer Hunter worthy of the Best Picture Award of 1978? The Deer Hunter. An in-depth examination of how the Vietnam War impacts and disrupts the lives of several friends in a small steel mill town in Pennsylvania.
In 1968, three friends in a tight-knit Slavic American community in western Pennsylvania, Mike, Stephen, and Nick, work in a steel mill and hunt deer with their co-workers, Stan and Axel, along with friend and bartender John. Mike, Stephen, and Nick are preparing to leave for military service in Vietnam. Stephen is engaged to Angela, who was secretly impregnated by another man. Mike and Nick are close friends who live together and both love Linda, who will be moving into their home to escape from her alcoholic father. While dancing at Stephen and Angela's wedding, Linda accepts Nick's spontaneous marriage proposal. Nick implores Mike to ensure he returns to Vietnam. Mike, Nick, and their friends go on a final hunting trip. Mike kills a deer with a single shot.
In 1969 in Vietnam, Mike, now a Green Beret, happens upon Nick and Stephen, who land in a village during an air assault mission. The three are soon imprisoned by the Viet Cong in a cage along a river and forced to participate in games of Russian roulette with the jailer's bets. Stephen fires his rounds at the ceiling and is forced into the cage with rats in the river. Mike convinces his captors to put 3 bullets into the revolver's cylinder. Mike kills 2 captors as he and Nick overpowers their captors. However, Nick is wounded in the leg. They quickly escape, rescuing Stephen in the process.
The trio floats down the river on a fallen tree trunk, but Nick and Stephen are weak from their wounds. They are rescued by an American helicopter, but Stephen falls back into the river while trying to grab onto the helicopter skids. Nick boards, however Mike drops down to help Stephen, whose legs are broken in the fall. Mike carries him until they meet refugees and a South Vietnamese army convoy fleeing to Saigon. Nick is treated at a U.S. military hospital, and once released, Nick, now suffering from PTSD, wanders into a gambling den. French businessman Julien Grinda persuades him to come inside. Upset, Nick interrupts a game of Russian roulette, pulling the trigger on himself. Mike is present as a spectator, but Nick and Julien quickly leave.
Sometime later, Mike returns home but cannot integrate into civilian life. He avoids a welcome home party, opting to stay alone in a hotel. He visits Linda and learns that Nick has deserted. Mike then visits Angela, who is now a mother but has slipped into a catatonic state following the return of Stephen, who has lost both of his legs in the war. Stan, Axel, and John understand nothing of war or what Mike has experienced. Linda and Mike find comfort in each other's company. During a hunting trip, Mike stops himself from shooting a deer and returns to the cabin, where he finds Stan cavalierly threatening Axel with his pistol. Mike takes it, chambers a single round, and triggers an empty chamber at Stan's head.
Mike visits Stephen at a veterans hospital. Both of Stephen's legs have been amputated, and he has lost the use of an arm. Stephen refuses to come home, saying he no longer fits in. He tells Mike he has regularly received large sums of money from Vietnam. Mike intuits that Nick is the source of these payments and forces Stephen to return home to Angela. Mike returns to Vietnam in search of Nick. Wandering around Saigon, which is now in chaos shortly before its fall, Mike finds Julian and persuades him to take him to the gambling den. Mike finds himself facing Nick, who has become a professional in the macabre game and fails to recognize Mike. Mike attempts to bring Nick back to reason by invoking memories of their hunting trips back home, but Nick maintains his indifference. However, during a game of Russian roulette between Mike and Nick, Nick recalls Mike's one-shot method and smiles before pulling the trigger and killing himself. Mike and his friends attend Nick's funeral, and the atmosphere at their local bar is dim and silent. Moved by emotion, John begins to sing God Bless America in honor of Nick as everyone joins in.
The Deer Hunter is directed by Michael Cimino.
Story by Michael Cimino, Derek Washburn, Louis Garfinkel, Quinn K. Reddecker, and screenplay by Derek Washburn.
Produced by Michael Cimino, Michael Deely, John Peverall, and Barry Spikings.
Music by Stanley Myers.
Cinematography by Vilmos Zsigmond.
Editing by Peter Zinner.
Casting by Sis Corman.
Art direction by Ron Hobbs and Kim Swados.
The Deer Hunter stars Robert De Niro as Michael. John
Cazale as Stan.
John Savage as Stephen.
Christopher Walken as Nick.
Meryl Streep as Linda.
George DeZunda as John.
Chuck Aspergren as Axel.
Shirley Stoller as Stephen's mother.
Ratanya Alda as Angela.
And Pierre Segui as Julian. So, John, The Deer Hunter, I have it playing behind me. As always, have the movie playing as we were recording. So hopefully 3 hours kinds of, last throughout this whole recording. We'll see. And we'll definitely have the whole intro. And that's, I think, where we kind of need to start, which is this whole intro to the film. And even before we get into that, I just want to know, had you seen this movie before?
This is a really interesting one because I've seen so many parts of the film. Michael coming home and not attending his own welcome back party. A lot of scenes with Linda. I had a directing professor in college who loved Meryl Streep. She was mega fan of Meryl Streep. So,
which is totally fair. So we'd watch so many scenes of her. So I think I'd watch 2 scenes with her in it from this movie. And they were obviously great, iconic scenes. But no, I never watched the entire film. It's one of those films that because of the Russian roulette, my brother, I guess, had watched it when we were younger, so he would always jokingly say, "Mao, Mao, Mao" to me all the time and put the gun up to his head. Very inappropriate, but, kids being kids. So there was a lot of references to this movie, even though it's so dark, there was a lot of, references throughout my life to this film, and yet I'd never seen it until about a couple weeks ago. So it was really great to finally get the full experience and sit down and feel the entire 3 hours, because you do feel the entire 3 hours of Deer Hunter. You definitely do feel the total 3 hours of the Deer Hunter. And I'm one to always say movies should be the length that however the director or filmmakers see fit. And I do think it works with sometimes how long this movie is, with the amount of breath that it gives it. But it is a 3 hour runtime, and you're like, yeah, you could definitely cut a good half hour, 40 minutes out of this and still have as good of a quality movie with what you're trying to tell. And part of that, and that's what I'm saying, let's get into this whole intro, is this hour-long wedding sequence that sets up the film. It starts out with kind of showing off the town that they're in. And it's a town that's in Western PA. It's a town that I commented looked like John's hometown area where he lives in PA himself, although it's a totally different part. But it just had that feel, this small town feel to it, where the entire town is centered around a factory, in this case a steel mill. And so that the movie starts within that mill, and you get this kind of feel for that this is the heart and this is the energy of what is surrounding this town. And then it starts to expand to a point where you're getting a lot of character background and development, a lot of relationships that are being told and displayed in a way that lets it breathe, but almost lets it breathe too much. And you start to wonder, where are we going with this? So, John, just initial thoughts on the intro, the whole wedding scene. What did you think after experiencing the first act of this film?
Yeah, I love that you called it an hour-long wedding scene. Well, it is majority of the first act is the wedding scene, but it's not like the entire hour long is with just the
It's
wedding
pretty
itself.
long.
Yeah.
I think it's like in the 50 minutes, and then that's when they get on the deer hunting trip, which
Yeah.
is they're still in their wedding clothes when they get to the deer hunting part.
Yeah, it's goofy. There's some goofy elements to this movie in general, but I think that's the biggest criticism. And there's a lot of positives to say. It's an iconic classic film. So there's tons of amazing moments and performances, but I think the runtime and the first act is definitely the biggest issue with The Deer Hunter. I think, like you said, it's an hour and 10 minutes before we get to Vietnam. Not that the whole film is really about the war itself. It's more about the impact that the war makes. It's not really about seeing cool action scenes or seeing big explosions, although there is some cool big explosions in this movie. But yeah, the opening wedding scene there, I mean, there's some really great moments in it. Obviously, we'll talk about the dripping of the wine, and you're trying to frame who these characters are, their relationship with each other. It almost feels like there's too many characters. Like we could have reduced one or two of the friends that they have, that aren't the main three with Michael and Nick with Steven. So I think that it does a great job of framing our town. It feels very authentic and it's real. And like you said, I currently bought a house right near a steel mill, like literally a 5-minute walk basically to a steel mill, or a minute drive. I drive by it every day, and it's very similar to what you see in this film, the rusty towers and the smokestacks. And obviously it's 2024, soon to be 2025, and it doesn't look the same as this. There's not constant workers. There's definitely, it's still in use, and you can see how it's been around for years and years. It's funny because my neighborhood was a predominant neighborhood for workers. It was built very close to the steel mill, so you could kind of walk to work or just have a quick, easy ride, someone drop you off. So I still feel the impact. And even the original owner of my house was a Vietnam veteran. I don't know if he worked at the steel mill per se. I can't really find that much information about him, but I find that peculiar and very interesting that I have that kind of impact and that connection to the film itself. But yeah, I really thought the wedding scene was definitely the best moment. That and the hunting scene of the opening. There are certain aspects like the traveling to the hunting scene that I'm like, okay, we didn't really need a 3-minute joke about him peeing and being left behind. Like, it's a funny bit, but it was a 3-minute scene back and forth. But let's focus on the wedding and talk about like the dynamics of the friends and what does it mean to go off to war. And it's almost like most of them really don't want to acknowledge that they're about to leave. And it's almost like the way they're talking about leaving, they don't understand the impact that's going to happen to them further down in the film. And especially if you've seen this movie before, I imagine that almost feels even more sad or even more ironic. So how did you feel about seeing this? I'm sure you've seen this multiple times. I know you have because you've seen all the films, but how did that feel, like seeing that opening act again and thinking about, oof, they don't even know what's coming?
Yeah, well, I didn't even know the first time I watched it. I didn't know what to expect. I literally did not even know that it was a Vietnam movie when I first started watching it. So I was just like, okay, like this scene is going on for a long time. This like sequence, of events leading up to the wedding. And I at times like I don't. It does feel unnecessary with some moments, but then I think some of the moments where like we are like, oh, we could have cut that, are the moments where I'm talking about letting the film breathe, where I'm just like, that adds this like new layer to like the life of these people. And so not that I necessarily like think that the wedding scene is like amazing and perfect as is, but I do see like why Cimino would want to let so many things breathe and want to establish just aspects of their lives. Now, I think what is more to me the downfall is the amount of storylines he like introduces within. I think you make a good point that it does feel like there is one too many guys within this main group. I do wonder if the John Cazale character Stan might have been originally thought of to be Steven. Probably not, but that I don't know if they like didn't put him in Vietnam because of how sick John Cazale was at the time of the filming. Dealing with lung cancer. And so I feel like if you took away like a character, it might have felt you might have felt like it worked, but then it almost feels like it's suffocated. But there's just like a lot going on, even to the point where there's this whole subplot that with Steven and Angela, that Angela is pregnant, but it's not actually Steven's kid. And so and that's not even a thing that is so outward either. It's very subtle, but it's also become a huge thing within the talking of the subtext of this film, where you're just like, why is this important now? Like, why was that even thought of to be added? The same level of attention to detail of they have to, you mentioned with taking the sip of wine, and they make this whole thing like, oh, if you spill a drop, it's like bad luck. And what happens? She spills a drop on her like wedding dress. And it's just like a lot of these sequences that feel very on the nose for what this movie is about, which is like what happens to a group of guys when they go to war, deal with trauma. It's like, okay, we get it. We get that something bad is going to happen. We get that there's a lot of foreshadowing that even with a Green Beret, veteran coming in to this like, wedding, I get it's a small town, but it just feels so out of left field and so too on the nose that it feels kind of a little amateur with the storytelling. But it also works because it creates that dichotomy later on in the movie you see with Mike coming back home. So there's a lot, I think, to like pick apart within the wedding scene and sequence in itself. But is there anything like, I guess, that you thought within the intro that did impress you? Was there anything that stood out? We'll talk about characters, in a bit, but just like anything technical wise or story wise that you thought worked well.
Yeah, I mean, Angela dropping the wine on her dress is kind of become an iconic image and moment in this movie, especially when it comes to the opening act. And I also love the inside baseball of just, when you think about filmmaking, you think of like the epic moments, the sweeping camera moves, or some epic action shot, or maybe some long monologue that an actor delivers. But no one ever thinks about, how do you film that little drop hitting a wedding dress? And it's like something that happens to people every day. You spill something on yourself, but how do you really capture that? And how do you capture that close up? And I love hearing the detail of Cimino just being so obsessed with this moment and this like imagery of, and we can talk about what that imagery means. Obviously, maybe it's death. It's the death of their marriage, even though it's beginning. It's the destruction of Steven's body. It's maybe just the bloodshed that Vietnam causes. There's a lot of different ways you can interpret that. But I love the idea that they just like, he fixated on trying to capture this moment. It just wasn't working. And the behind the scenes stories of how they wasted an entire day just trying to get this one shot. And then they eventually, instead of trying to, change in jerry-rig it in a way that the cup perfectly drops, they just eventually had Cimino standing high up on a ladder and drop a single drop on her dress. So it's those small little details of learning things behind the scenes that I always love. So I want to open that up and ask you specifically, like, what do you think that's implying? What is the drop on her wedding dress, the blood or the wine spilling across her?
I think it's just the symbolism that bad fortune is about to hit them. That this is not a marriage that not necessarily is going to last, but it's like there's not a lot of good fortune with them, and that I think that's, and it's kind of like all of them are going to deal with some bad luck, with some hard times. So I think that's more. I think that's like literally how deep it goes, and I think that's kind of one of my problems with the movie in general is that it goes deep, but what it presents you is like, that's it. Like, that's what it's trying to say. It's not trying to go any deeper, which is why it's confusing with the added storylines, like this whole subplot that it's not actually Steven's kid, which I guess is another like symbolism of the marriage being bad and the blood, or the wine, I shouldn't say blood, dropping on the white dress. Where it's just like you add these subtleties into it, but then you don't expand and go into more. And if it wasn't just so much of it, I don't feel like we would feel as convinced that the wedding scene is just too much and too long.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is way too long. Like I said, it's an hour and 10 minutes, the first act. And what you want to see is like the change, but you need to set that up. You need to set up these characters. And I think they do a good job of introducing, there's a little bit of a love triangle between Linda and Robert De Niro's Michael and, Christopher Walken's character, Nick. So there's kind of like a potential interest between both of them, but Nick, does a quick, sudden proposal, which don't we love? I'm going off to war, marry me,
Yeah.
With the classic cinema
what you
trope.
gotta do.
Yeah, it's what you got to do. I guess it's not even a cinema trope. It's just a human thing, right? You think it might be your last moments here. I find that most interesting is kind of like each person's perspective. Michael, Nick and then Steven's perspective on going to war. And it almost feels like Nick he's not cocky, but he almost seems to like not care, or he seems the least afraid about what's about to happen. And then obviously knowing the end and the trauma and the whole impact that he has throughout the whole film, it's interesting that he feels like he's obviously a little bit worried. They have a great conversation, him and Robert De Niro, about going to war, but he doesn't realize the true depths about what he's about to experience. And I think that makes it even more traumatic. And even more sad that we see him end up the way he did. So what do you feel about the love triangle between Meryl Streep's Linda and Michael and Nick?
Well, I think it just sets up a really interesting plot and dynamic. And I mean, Meryl Streep is she's great in this. And it's like one of her like early films. She's gorgeous in it. And so it's like you can tell why like both these guys would be, kind of obsessed with her. Absolutely. And you get that history that, they've probably all known each other since they were young, since they all probably grew up with each other. And I think like that's to me, like that's why it's so important to build out like a love triangle like that, to build out all this like backstory to them. So you fall in love with these characters. You understand that like Nick is the gentle one and Mike's the more rough and tumble one, but Mike is kind of the wiser one, the strongest guy. And maybe this is kind of my question back to you, is just like who is like the alpha, within this like friend group and this dynamic, because you have two guys that scream that kind of energy, and so and that's what's so fascinating. That's what I get so engrossed in, and I think like that's why it's so impactful of what happens at the end and what they go through. So let's, to talk about like the character dynamics, like how do you see this group? Who's the alpha in this? Do you think that Mike, the way he acts is that's why he was able to get out, or is it just like he got lucky?
Yes.
In a sense.
I think that's such an interesting question to pose, because Nick is the soft one. We definitely see he's the most emotional and soft, and maybe that's why he breaks the most in that way.
Yeah.
Steven, played by John Savage, is kind of I would say he is almost the leader of the pack, but it's because he's louder. He's more boisterous. I think he presents a more of a louder presence in a way that Michael doesn't. He's more quiet. He's watching everything, but I think that really reveals himself as the true really leader of these men. He also goes on to be a Green Beret, while the other men are just serving in the Army or the Marines. I'm not quite sure. But
I think it's just the Army.
Just the Army, right? Which that also is interesting in itself, that he is able to kind of reach that higher tier of status in the military. I think he is that quiet leader, and I think that's why he doesn't break. I mean, he is very much disturbed and affected by the events of the war, and we see that with him coming home. He doesn't even want to meet up with his friends. You would think after not seeing these people for such a long time and going through all these things, you would love to go back and see your friends, but he even hides in a hotel because he's almost afraid of seeing them and them not being affected by the war.
Yeah, he's the strong one, and I think the beginning establishes like he is the strongest. He's probably the most tactical.
Yes,
I would
definitely,
say. Yeah, definitely. I don't know if, and I hate to even use this term, but do you think they try and make him a little bit of a dirtbag?
Michael? I think he just is like, I wouldn't say dirtbag. I would say more of just doesn't care about his appearance, doesn't really care about image, doesn't care.
But then he looks probably the best. He's like, De Niro's a good looking guy, but in this film, and he looks great like in the suit. Even like Linda, Meryl Streep character, kind of makes a comment. She's like, "Whoa, like you look pretty good," dressed up like this. So it's interesting to then see how he then softens up, because he feels so hardened at the beginning, but then he really does soften up and really opens up with it. And I think like an example of like why everyone looks up to him, but he's also kind of full of shit, is in the beginning when they're all walking out of the factory and they're like pointing to the sky, like at the sun. They're like, "Oh, what's that?" Like kind of, I don't even know what that is. I don't know if that's just like an effect from like the factory smoke, like kind of fucking with the sun.
Yeah.
But it looked like some like dots in the sky. And then Mike's like, "Oh, those are sun dogs. It means a blessing on the hunter sent by the great wolf to his children." It's an old Indian thing. like he says it like so offhand,
Yeah.
but says it with a confidence, but it's also sort of like, you're just bullshitting, but they all believe him. They're like, oh, but yeah, Mike, like you know what you're talking about. And so that's why I feel like he's like this like leader, but he doesn't know how to properly lead. He just knows how to kind of be like the strong one, and which leads to the whole like this is this, you know, back and forth between him and Stan, which is just brilliant acting.
What do you mean this is this? What does that even mean? Yeah, it's such a great moment. Yeah.
So it's so good. And it really is just kind of nonsense, but because they're both such good actors, it just works so well.
Yeah, it's the way he's so confident, the way he says something. And maybe it's because he learned it from his father, who maybe taught him hunting, and it kind of has passed that down. Yeah. And he has all these just like random little facts. I feel like we all know someone who just like whips out nature facts every once in a while, or just some random thing. We're like, where did that come from? Like, how did you even know that? You know, and they're knowledgeable, and they on the surface, they seem less intelligent than they really are. Right. They're someone that's somehow has retained a lot of information. They know a lot, but when they speak, which is not often, it seems like kind of more impactful and meaningful. And yeah, it's almost like he gets more quiet, but then has to be or opened up, and only really feels comfortable opening up to Linda, which is interesting, because he doesn't feel that way.
Which is like it's not even that much he opens up to her. He's just like, it just shows that he's like feeling a certain way, like he's dealing with his trauma, but he still won't open up, which is kind of, I guess, like one of the issues with him and trying to integrate back into the world, is that he doesn't know how to show this like vulnerable side, because even in Vietnam, he was the one having to, you know, hold Steven while Steven was crying, while Nick was like freaking out. Like he had to still be the strong one. Yeah. In that situation.
Definitely. Well, I think we see more of the friends dynamics as we end the wedding, and they are drunk and goofy and stripping, and you get to really see more of who they are. Again, I do think it's too long, but we get to the hunting scene, right? This movie's called Deer Hunter, or The Deer Hunter. I'm like, where is the hunting scene? Where's the actual killing of the deer, you know? So we finally get to this, and it's almost like hunting is, obviously this is a lot of people's opinion on hunting. Hunting isn't really about hunting. It's more just about hanging out with your bros and getting drunk, you know, getting away from the women in your life to go hang out in the woods and drink endless amounts of beer. So one, I already commented on the goofy drive away joke that they pull on one of their friends. Of course, he's the fat friend John, who of course gets all the freaking jokes thrown at him, of course, because I guess every friend group has that one character you poke fun at. But I understand that it's just a little bit unnecessary and long. But what did you think about the overall hunting scene? And then I want to break down, like, what does that mean, and why is Michael the hunter, and what does that kind of impactfully mean for the rest of the film?
The hunting scene and these like mountainous landscapes, it's really beautiful. And with the score, the cavatina theme, it is just really beautiful. And it's funny because those mountain scenes weren't actually filmed in PA. They were filmed, I think, in Washington State. Yeah. So it's funny how, like, you know, you want to believe like this is like a close place for like me and you to get to. It's just really not. But
as a PA guy, I knew immediately. I mean, there's...
Oh, you did?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I lived near Blue Mountain, I think, which is like the biggest mountain range in Pennsylvania. It doesn't look half the size of those mountains. Like, those are huge mountains. So I knew immediately.
Yeah. And I think like, and I think it's interesting that Cimino would do that, because there's points where he's like tries to emphasize like authenticity, but then it's like, why wouldn't you just like film in the mountains unless you felt like it didn't really look good enough on film? And that's the thing, is it pops these scenes, the scene with all of them changing when they get up to the mountain, and the whole this is this scene, it's beautiful. Like, how often are you going to have all these guys just in nature like that? It's so quiet, it feels empty, but there's so much around them. And it makes it feel, it creates that intimacy that again has been clearly established for an hour already in this movie. And it just keeps developing. So I love the hunting scenes. Now, what it actually means, I think it's, again, playing this dichotomy of beautiful America. There's no war here. Here are these guys that get to shoot their guns, and they're just getting to kill, the deer for sport. Whereas in Vietnam, it's so totally different. It's this hot tropical landscape where there's danger everywhere. They're being hunted. They're no longer the deer hunters. They're the deer themselves, type of thing. So to me, like that's what it all. I think that's like kind of the point of why it looks so beautiful and why they're trying to show those differences. But maybe there is more to it. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I think you're exactly right. I think there's a moment where Nick talks to Michael and he's so romantic about Vietnam. Like, oh, like the jungle, and I want to see the tropics. And he's almost talking about the Vietnam War as a vacation in a way, where he's just like, yeah, I can't wait to like, experience what it's like in another place and be in a tropical jungle. And it's ironic because they're in an evergreen jungle in a way where they're just surrounded by forests, and it's completely different. And he's romanticizing about what it's like to be somewhere else. He's kind of that friend who just wants to get out of his small town. He wants to like see the world, but he's just pulled into the worst possible way of seeing the world, which is war. And I think that there's a lot of things that kind of mirror and reflect each other. And while it may not be the deepest, I think that those mirrorings and even the small moments like that conversation that Nick has with Michael makes the film very powerful. And even though it's not as deep and subtle, the parallels and the mirroring from the first act to the third act, I think is really what makes this film really outstanding. I wanted to talk about Michael's phrase, one shot, which again mirrors throughout the film, comes out in the very end of the film as well. One shot, Michael refers to it as in it takes one shot to kill a deer. If you hit it in the right spot, it takes one shot to kill an animal. One, I found that really interesting because it kind of implies one shot. And in the war itself, it takes one shot to die. It's a quick second. You don't even know if it might come. It takes one bullet out of thousands that are being shot at you to kill you. And I think that is how you could look at that directly. I think he's also the most accurate and best hunter of them, as we kind of clearly see of his knowledge about hunting. And we get to see it demonstrated where he kills a deer, which I thought was very interesting because when they killed the deer, it looked so real. Before we get to the one shot, how did you feel about him shooting the deer and seeing it? It looks so real where I was like, did they really kill a deer? Until I read what they did.
I don't know. I mean, I think because I knew like it's a movie, they can't actually do that. Yeah. I had no worry about I'm like, oh, they probably trained this deer somehow or, some way. So I really had no fear, I think, for that.
Yeah, I wasn't fearful. I read that it was a tranq dart that they shot the deer with. And that's why it's so purposefully just like kind of spun in a circle and just collapsed. I think it was that movement which felt so real to me, and it felt a little disturbing in a way. But it was accurate. I mean, it's the death of an animal. And this film is just surrounded by death, really.
Yeah, and I think this one shot idea happens, it's kind of persistent throughout. And I think mainly, and, this is actually a funny thing I heard while like kind of looking into this movie is the one shot thing works with the Russian roulette idea.
Yeah.
Also, these guys are all Russian born, playing Russian roulette.
Yep.
Taking shots of alcohol at the beginning of the movie.
Again, not very subtle. Such subtle,
Subtle. Yeah, it's not subtle at all. But I think that it's this idea, that a war, it just takes one shot, one thing that changes you forever. So it's a little scary to like think about, but it makes sense in this like in this weird way. It's like almost like redneck like Taoisms.
Yeah.
The Tao of rednecks is kind of like, one shot type of thing, which I think, I don't know if we want to talk about how political this movie is in reference to today, but it's very on the nose and feels very interesting for even today's political landscape.
Well, how so? I want to hear your takes on that.
Well, it's just like these people who are in this small town who have never really experienced, any sort of trauma. And it's sort of then these same small town people who are voting in, voting in a president that does not give a shit about them. And they feel like, well, we have to fight for America, that we have this small community. We have something to fight for, to protect. But it's almost like thrown in their face again within Vietnam. It's like, no one gives a shit about you, how Vietnam veterans were treated. So it's just like, it's interesting just to see, again, like how these, and I think I saw it with the Times called it. They called it a blue collar epic when they reviewed the movie in '78. So it already had that kind of like, true red-blooded American feel, which is, and not to talk all the way at the ending and talk too much about that just yet, but singing God Bless America, some people thought that was a slap in the face, and Cimino in a way sort of was like, no, like that's sort of to like praise America, like how we can all come together under it. It's not supposed to be a slap in the face, but some people took it that way.
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of look at it politically like that. I feel like war has always been that way, though. There's always kind of a misunderstanding of, especially a war like Vietnam. And I think you could look at, the wars in the Middle East and how we're still have presence there, and how there's still an understanding that going into the military and fighting for your country is the best thing to do. And whether I feel that way or not, I don't really know. I don't really know what it means to go to war nowadays. Some people say there is no war. Some people say that there is constantly a war, whether, our politicians or the news is telling you. It's never going to be as crazy, hopefully, as the Vietnam War again. I'm hoping. No. I'm hoping. But
oh boy.
Yeah, I feel like when you look at this film and compare it to nowadays, there is a sense of patriotism. I don't know if I feel that from watching the film. I don't know if I feel anti-patriotism from the film, like you said. I think when we get to the end of the film and talk about that final scene, it'll be interesting because there's a lot of ways to look at it. I think there's a lot of ways that you could look at it as a negative thing, but I think when we have the context of Cimino and learning that a little bit more and having a little bit more information from him kind of expands it a little bit further. But yeah. Before we get to the actual Vietnam War, we get to the bar scene, which is kind of like the end of our friendship and our heroes. So is there anything you want to wrap up before we get to the war itself?
Shout out to the split diopter shot of
so cool.
Stan listening to John playing the piano. Love that. Yeah, it's like this calm before the storm sort of moment. I think my question more is like, how are you feeling about these characters at this point in the movie? Was there a character you're rooting for the most? Did you want to see, sort of I don't know what your expectations would have been at that time before we get into Vietnam, and where you're at with the characters.
Not knowing
maybe there's a performance you like.
Yeah, not knowing the film, I was surprised that not everyone goes to war. I mean, you're building up all these men, and some of the men feel older, and that's a bigger question as well. Like, how old are these guys supposed to be? It almost is they're supposed to be like younger than us. Like, there's some of them, especially the main three, are supposed to be like 25, maybe. They look like they're almost 40 years old. All of them, though, like they all look so old, which I guess is just the time of the 70s. Maybe it has to do with fashion, and I don't know. I don't know what it is about them. They all look so much older than people in their 20s, but. Yeah, I feel like like I said, with how many characters there are, I don't feel like I fully get enough. I feel like the film would have been much better with the three and then maybe one who stays. One person who kind of stays at home, like John's character, that we could maybe look at and see the difference between him not going to war and understanding what it's like and how it can affect your mental state. And then between the three of them that are all kind of like crippled in different ways. So I mean, it's powerful, especially when they're in the bar, because you don't realize that it's really the last time that they're all going to be together until later on when you kind of re-enter that bar and see the atmosphere and see what it's like again. So, yeah, I mean, John Cazale is just fantastic. It's his last film, as you mentioned. It's tragic in general in a lot of different ways because he's also supposedly dating Meryl Streep at the time, and they're in a relationship, and he has lung cancer, and they had to film all the scenes specifically of him before anything else because he ended up dying before the film ended, which is just tragic. And he has such an amazing career. We constantly have praised him here on Worthy, and it's hard not to think that like what his career would have been. You know what I mean? Like, if he would have still been around like Robert De Niro, if he would have been, still doing these side roles, or would he have had the chance to really lead a film in a way that we never really got to see?
Yeah, I don't know. It's like one of those true tragedies of in Hollywood, his loss. And he's so good. And there's like, you watch this movie knowing that he was so sick and what he was dealing with, and then seeing how he throws himself around, how his physicality, how emotional he gets in this film, and he really puts it out on the line, and it's pretty incredible. for somebody who, for all you're hearing, is like just sick and dying the entire time while they were making this. I mean, there are stories about that the filmmakers didn't even want him, but they, De Niro convinced them to do it, to help get insurance, to help pay for that. Streep was on it just because I was there and she was, taking care of him, as his partner at the time. So it's really sad, but he jumps off the screen again, so like with so much energy and this weight. And again, this scene is about to come up on my screen, and just he's so good in this. It's so, because he feels, again, like you get the sense that his character growing up was sort of picked on, was sort of the runt of the litter. And so that, they make fun of him, but that there's still so much emotion. He still has a lot to prove, somewhat similar to Alfredo and, in Godfather. I could have been somebody, or wow, now I'm quoting On the Waterfront, just there's so much energy that is so palpable in this movie. It's really great,
but it's naturalistic. He's so natural. And I watched,
they're all naturalistic. All of them are.
They really are. I watched an interview of Robert De Niro talking about him and how he was just one of the best performers to work with, because, and you can see it. I mean, there's certain actors that you can just tell that they have an ego, either sometimes when they're even on screen as a character. And he talked about the opposite, which he felt that there's partners that just give and take, and they're so good at listening that you forget that they're even a character at that point. And he looked at John as being that kind of like prime example of a great actor who was always present, who could always kind of react in a naturalistic way. And there is some improving on this film. And I wonder how much between him and Robert De Niro was improv, and they have such a strong relationship already at this point. So I wonder how much they were able to kind of like manipulate and kind of flex on screen. And some of the scenes feel that way. I mean, this I think could have been maybe a improv line by him. I doubt it because it's so impactful, but there's a lot of chemistry that he always has with every single character, and a sense of naturalism that I just always love.
Yeah. And Walken, especially, really carries and supports this like other aspect and dynamic of the group, playing with De Niro's character. It's all such good acting. I wrote in some of my notes, I was like, this movie is why there should be a best casting ensemble category at the Oscars. Like, this is a perfect example of how they nailed every aspect. Even with Axel's character, the actor who played him, Chuck Aspegren, he was just a townie of the town they filmed in, and he was just like, oh, I'm interested in this, and they were like, you're pretty good, and they added him in. And it's not like Axel does anything that crazy. He's kind of just this big presence and energy, but it works. And I think to myself, I'm like, man, where has this guy been? What other movies has he been in? Because I kind of want to see more. And he didn't really do much else. Same thing with the George Zunda who played John. It wasn't really many other film roles. So it's just really interesting how all these guys came together and it worked. I mean, even with Cimino, I read somewhere that he gave the 6 of the principal male characters carried a photo in their back pocket depicting them all together as children. So it enhanced this sort of like method acting, this like that there's so much weight and history already behind them. Yeah. That it within just a prop that to hold. But which is why I like the intro, and I don't mind the length, but also I know why it doesn't work, as well. So it's really fascinating with how it all gets built up within this and how the characters develop. So I think we should get into the Vietnam sequence. It's sort of the part 2 of this 3-part story. So we go from the beautiful mountains of what's supposed to be Western PA, but really Washington State, and it's then bam, it drops right into Vietnam, right into a fight. There's some very graphic violence, including a Viet Cong, soldier throwing grenades into a pit full of civilians who are hiding, which was like, what the fuck when I first watched that. And then De Niro's, has a flamethrower blowing the guy up. There's a lot of explosion. It's just madness, you're being dropped into. And then that leads right into what I think is probably the best part of the movie and why it's as good as it is and how mastercrafted it is, which is the Russian roulette scene. Yeah. First on Russian roulette, because it's such a controversial topic, there's so much that people go, but when they speak negatively about this movie, they point out the Russian roulette because there's really no clear evidence that that was going on as a method of torture or even just a thing that Viet Cong would do.
Sure.
So there's no historical backing to it. And I think as like weird as it is that they did it, I still think it works. And I'm able to disregard it because within the world of the movie, the movie, the screenplay itself was based off of a Russian roulette story, not necessarily a movie about Vietnam and friends. It was first developed, its first basis was a Russian roulette kind of movie. So what do you think about using that and the almost like dishonesty of the truthful things that happened in Vietnam, and then basically like how this movie, it's sort of just like, okay, like we know that it's not true, but we still are going to use it anyways to help tell this story.
Yeah. I mean, I think it works because it's not too far fetched. And I don't think this is anything against the Viet Cong, but there was a lot of just horrible malpractice when it came to the Vietnam War. I mean, no rules of war were really followed. There's a very set rule that you're not supposed to break, or series of rules that you're not supposed to break in war, and they were constantly broken, and not just by the Viet Cong, by the Americans as well. So I think it works because it's not too far-fetched. You would imagine that there were obviously in like prison camps just like this, and these men would find a way to kind of entertain themselves in the most horrific way possible, and it makes it even more disturbing that you're taking your main characters and then making them do it together. And making them face off together is truly the most dramatic you could possibly get into a film, especially not knowing, and the tension of not knowing if the bullet's there or not. So it works so well. I think the whole scene is framed really well, and you're kind of established in this little small prison camp that's right on the water. And it's horrific the way that the men just have to like stand in water while they're waiting to be the next participants in this game is truly fucked up. I think honestly it's so disturbing because there's not as much of a build up to it as you would expect. Like you're just there. You don't even really see them captured, which I find so interesting. And I think that also the pacing of the Vietnam sequences, I think makes the whole film feel longer, especially the first part. It feels so much longer because the pacing is so fast when you get to Vietnam. It's like he's there. You quickly see this quick action scene. You see the disturbing moments, which, yeah, you mentioned the grenade tossing in the pit. Like that is by far to me the most disturbing thing in this entire movie.
Yeah.
And you see the woman like holding her baby who's like severely injured, who was in that pit. Like so disturbing. I definitely think, I mean, the Russian roulette stuff is so disturbing, but I by far think that's the most absolutely fucked up thing in this movie. But I think it's the way it's portrayed. A lot of the takes in the first act when they're home, it's just long takes. You're on sticks, you're just on a tripod. And then we cut to these Vietnam sequence and they're so handheld. You can feel that the cameraman's like in the water as they're filming. And it's beyond disturbing the way they lock them in a cage that's completely submerged and that there's rats in there. And seeing Steven kind of break down, which is just so tragic because the whole first act is about celebrating him and this new life that he's about to have. And of course, he's the one who's like breaking down the most. And then you get to see Nick and Michael kind of plot, I guess you would say, and escape. But this isn't the great escape. It's not built up in a way that's like heroic at all. It's just so tragic. I mean, they're screaming and crying before it happens. It's not like what you would expect in a John Wayne picture where he's just, he's going to get out of this. And I think that's why the tension and the drama works so well, because you really have no idea if one of these characters are going to die. And you see that. I mean, Steven almost blows his own brains out, and he would have killed himself if he didn't do what he did, which is shoot at the ceiling and grazes his head. So one, it sets the stakes to an unbelievable high, and there's a sense of realism that I think carries over from the first act in the same way that town feels real, and those men and the job they do feels very real, and the women around them, they feel very real. And I think that's why the film works so well. And I think that's why you care so much about these characters. And of course you get the kind of action-y scene of them breaking out. I mean, it's still badass seeing Robert De Niro
Yeah.
kill all those guys there, right? As disturbing as it is leading up to it, it's still pretty badass watching him take out those guys. And it feels so good because you're like, fuck these guys. Like, this is horrific watching them do this to human beings. It doesn't matter what side you are. It's just a horrible thing. So there's a sense of like relief finally when that happens, but it's not over yet.
Yeah. And I find even more badass him and John Savage like having to try and climb on the helicopter skids and like swinging their legs, and like those were real stunts that they did. Like they dropped themselves into the water like I think like 15 times, I think is what I read, to get that shot. So it's pretty wild. And there's a quote that I have, it's pretty chunky, but it was from the producer Michael Dealey, talking about Cimino's comments on the nature and motives of the film, sort of commenting on like why Russian roulette, like why this. And I thought, to me, like it made the most sense, and I think like it's a perfect explanation for what the film is about and what to really get out of it, and why you can sort of okay the use of Russian roulette as this allegory, which is what he says. But basically, this is what he says. He says the Deer Hunter wasn't really about Vietnam. It was something very different. It wasn't about drugs or the collapse of the moral of the soldiers. It was about how individuals respond to pressure. Different men reacting quite differently. The film is about three steel workers in extraordinary circumstances. Apocalypse Now, which comes out around the same time, is surreal. The Deer Hunter is a parable. Men who fight and lose an unworthy war. Men who fight and lose an unworthy war face some obvious and unpalatable choices. They can blame their leaders or they can blame themselves. Self-blame has been a great burden for many war veterans. So how does a soldier come to terms with his defeat and yet still retain his self-respect? One way is to present the conquering enemy as so humane and the battle one way is to present the conquering enemy as so inhuman and the battle between the good guys, us, and the bad guys, them, so uneven as to render defeat irrelevant. Inhumanity was the theme of the Deer Hunter's portrayal of the North Vietnamese prison guards, forcing American prisoner of wars to play Russian roulette. The audience's sympathy with prisoners who quite understandably cracked thus completes the chain. Accordingly, some veterans who suffered in that war found the Russian roulette a valid allegory. So yeah, it's about the pressure applied in extraordinary circumstances in moments that are not human. So it's this like these people from the small town who really only know their lives are then forced to crack, and put under so much weight of having to potentially kill themselves, see their friends die in front of them, go through circumstances that no human should have to go through. And so I think that's why having the Russian roulette is sort of okay to me, because it really emphasizes that, where I think other war movies, which we've seen before, it's effective, but then it almost feels sort of like, but I've seen that, with an All Quiet on the Western Front. We don't see that in The Best Years of Our Lives. I'm trying to think of like other war movies, which isn't too much, I guess, at this time that's going to be like as visceral and graphic, which is what makes this jump out so much, which is what makes a scene and using something like Russian roulette be like, what the fuck am I looking at right now?
Yeah,
it's so bizarre that it makes you feel so uneasy with what you're seeing.
Yeah, it's just torture, really, even though it's not just direct torture like you think of tying someone up and hitting them or beating them in some way. It's torture, and it's even more torturous because when you're pinning your friend, and I doubt the Viet Cong even knew, maybe they just saw the two men chatting and they were like, yeah, bring both of them up. They know each other. Like, let's make this even more fun by having two people that know each other do this game, which makes it that much more disturbing. And the little behind the scene tidbit that I read of, they had an actor who was playing the lead Viet Cong member there who's kind of running the games, and they originally had someone who just was incapable of physically slapping the actors, and they eventually hired someone who was a local Thai man because they shot a lot of the Vietnam stuff in Thailand, and they found someone who just was known to dislike Americans. I don't know how they found this person, but they hired him and casted him in that role, and De Niro asked him basically to slap Christopher Walken without realizing, and they did, and that's the take that kind of made it into the film. And it is that sense of realism and naturalism that I think is what makes it so much more powerful. And, when we do research, we watch a lot of different things. We read a lot of different things. We use YouTube obviously as a great resource. And when you go into these videos, whether it's just about the film, maybe the Cimino talking about it, there's so many comments that I've seen on YouTube that are from war veterans from Vietnam saying, hey, I was a veteran in Vietnam. This movie was extremely impactful. I haven't seen a film that kind of portrays PTSD and the struggles that you go through when you're in war. And I saw that multiple times. This wasn't just like an offhand comment here or there. So this film has impacted people and still, I think, is looked at as one of the quintessential Vietnam films, even though it's not like a Platoon that's about the entire war, or it's not an Apocalypse Now that it's about the in and outs of the war. It's more about the trauma that war afflicted.
Well, it's also interesting where this is like a Vietnam film without being in Vietnam, I think, for that much. I mean, you're still in it, I guess I should say, for a good amount of time, but it's not like the sense that you would see in a Platoon, that you saw in Apocalypse Now, where you're deep in the jungle. Hell, even to Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump, I think, spent more time in Vietnam than it feels like these guys did.
Yeah.
But the impact that they felt was really deep because you were centralized in this one place. So it's interesting to call it a Vietnam film, where it totally is. But it's like Vietnam is like not even the point. It's not like, it's as if, because I feel like other war films have a message of like why we should not have been in that war. Whereas like this doesn't really have that message. It does not try to comment on the politics of the Vietnam War, the reasonings, like any thoughts behind it. It's really just about the impact of war and what soldiers deal with when they come home.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if even soldiers. I wonder if they had even just made these guys like, what's that movie? The one with Burt Reynolds. They're
on the river,
dueling banjos. What's with dueling
Deliverance?
banjos? Fuck, Deliverance. So like, imagine even if like these guys were just like, yeah, we're just gonna go on a backpacking trip in like Vietnam, and then they got captured, and then they were forced to play Russian roulette. Like that could have even worked here too, as like the parable and that, for what was going on. So like, it doesn't even matter that there is war, but obviously it sends a message that, that war is bad, but also just like the traumas and the visuals of it, really impact you.
Yeah, it's just a little over 20 minutes that we're really seeing the war, and majority of that time, it's really just one scene that you're seeing the war, and then they're captured, which again, they don't even show them being captured. That's not even the point. We're kind of skipped right into the Russian roulette scenes. Afterwards, we see them somewhat escape, but they're separated in a way that they don't really kind of describe. It's kind of said off screen, or it's kind of explained later in the film that they were all separated, and that's why it's Michael's journey to come back and basically find them and find Nick especially. But we see the death numbers kind of stack up in Vietnam as you're seeing like nurses and soldiers and all the bodies. There's a really great shot where you see like the American flag waving, and you're just surrounded by dead bodies and military men loading them into the cars. And you don't realize it at the time, but it's Nick's point of view. And it like cuts to Nick in the hospital, and he's the one looking down at all these dead bodies. And he's probably thinking, well, he pulls his photo out of Linda, but he's probably thinking like, is Michael in one of those body bags? Is Steven in one of those body bags? Like, he has no idea where his friends are. And there's the iconic scene where the doctor comes up to Christopher Walken, and you finally get to see him kind of interact after being in the war. And I think that is the scene that they called out that Christopher Walken is winning the Oscar, right? Is that correct, Ben?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that's his Oscar scene.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that muted state where you're like, whoa, this is not Nick. Like, we saw Nick. He's emotional, but he's not like silent and can barely speak. And he has PTSD so bad that he like can't remember his parents' basic information when they were born. It's truly heartbreaking stuff.
Yeah, and it's probably a thing that, doctors probably didn't even really know how to like deal with. Like no one really knew like how do you deal with somebody who, is dealing with this. They think, okay, well, maybe we'll just shake it off type of thing. But yeah, it's so stark with, how he's just sitting there in silence and barely able to speak. He's like a little kid, like, I don't like, where are my parents type of like feeling, like just completely lost.
Yeah.
And to me, like, yeah, that's the that's the Oscar moment. That's the moment you show in the award ceremony of like, and now Christopher Walken, the deer hunter, and it just shows that. And it's so powerful without having to do much. And again, there's a lot of like breath within that. That could have been a very quick scene. Did not have to have, the doctor and nurses like walking around seeing all the bodies leading up to it. Didn't have to have much of Nick looking at the bodies. Could have been a very quick like 1-2 second shot. But there's just so much time spent and letting him observe, letting him, see what he could have been in those body bags as well. So it's really powerful. And yeah, to me, like that is the moment for Walken in the movie. There's so many great moments, but to me, that was it. So one thing that I, still trying to figure out is like how Michael was able to like, get to Saigon and like find the Russian roulette ring himself. And he's like, it's almost like, again, it's like Cimino and the screenwriter's like choice to like do that. And it's one of those moments where you're just like, did you have to do that? Like, what if Michael hadn't been there? What if like Nick had just seen that? I think it might have created more tension with Michael because you wouldn't have known that he's like watching it with like a fascination. But then I guess like even that, like I don't know what that's supposed to comment on. It's supposed to comment on that he's like enjoys watching it. He enjoys the torture of it as like a comfort, or is he doing it because he doesn't really know what to do with himself, and this is like his own PTSD?
Yeah.
And sort of like, again, playing on this idea that Nick is the one who will do it, but he won't.
So are you referring to when he sees Nick again for the first time, who interrupts the Russian roulette scene, or are you saying the end when he is searching for Nick?
No, the first time when Nick interrupts.
Yeah, and it's like, why is Michael there? Like, we know Christopher Walken, who's clearly, he's like a walking ghost at this point in the movie, who's just wandering. He tries to sleep with a prostitute. He can't even do that because there's a kid in the room, and he
asks to be called Linda, or asks the girl to call herself Linda.
Yeah, some really disturbing stuff. He clearly still has this need to return home that somehow gets lost. And I guess it's maybe him running into the roulette ring. But yeah, why is Michael there? Is Michael there to relive his traumas, to kind of like move past it, almost like a form of therapy in a way? Is he just, like you said, like witnessing that this is a common trait throughout Saigon, as well as the Viet Cong are using it as a form of entertainment? But it's not like he's there to find Nick, because if Nick wasn't there, he would have left already. Nick walks in while Michael's already there, sitting there, and you don't see Michael betting. So yeah, it's a great question. Like, why is he really there? But you already get the sense that Michael is looking for Nick. And that then leads up to Nick returning home to the steel factory with his friends all welcoming him. And he doesn't join the welcome party, which is a beautiful scene. And it's kind of the reintroduction to Linda and his character. But it's just, again, this movie just beats you over the head, and in not a bad way. It's really powerful, but it's just so tragic that Michael, who up in this point you think is kind of unaffected by this whole experience. And it's not until this moment where he returns home, or doesn't even want to return home, that you start to kind of unravel his character and see that, oh, this man is also just as broken. And then it kind of takes him down the journey of finding Steve next, and finding Nick back in Saigon. So what did you think of his return home, or his lack of return home, and his kind of investigation to find Steven as well?
Yeah, so this is like the third act of the film, and I think like this is the one that I don't know if I have the most questions about, because there's so much I want to see happen. I want to see more of Mike and Linda's relationship develop. I want to see them not just be like, well, I need comfort, from him, where it's like I'm dealing with this PTSD and trauma, and she's obviously dealing with the sadness and the loneliness. So I wish there was like some more interactions between the two, some more like love, because you do get that love triangle, but because it's so subtle, because there's so much time not spent on furthering it rather than just establishing a base level, it feels like a little like weak compared to the rest of it. But it's also, trying to develop the other people. You have I think the return home is interesting, because you do wonder, like, Michael, why can't you just walk back in? You wonder if maybe they had him come back into that and maybe show his reservedness being a little different, maybe had a little bit of an outburst, how that would have played off. But I also, so it's interesting to see like how they could have done it, but then the way they chose to do it is very obvious. It makes you realize, whoa, he really is dealing with something deep right now that he can't confront it.
Yeah.
When you think he's so strong.
And I wonder if it has to do with the women or Linda in particular, where it's like he obviously feels close to Linda. They were living together at a certain point, probably has romantic feelings. I think that's kind of somewhat established. But I wonder if he...
Oh, he definitely does.
Yeah.
Definitely
And
does.
I wonder if he just feels like he wants to just see her, because in a weird way, she wasn't in the war, but she knows about pain and loss because of the war, because Steven hasn't returned home, or because Nick hasn't returned home. She knows that kind of pain in the same way that he wants to know where Nick is just as much as she does. So maybe if it was just him returning to her, he would have had no problem, because clearly he has no problem with doing that. The following day, he still meets up with her. So it's not like he's completely afraid to interact with any of the people. It's more so he doesn't want to see his buddies who are in the steel mill that just will not understand. And you see that later in the film, where his friends just don't understand the impact that war had on him, and the way they, especially like the way they, garnish a gun, and he just can't believe that they're willing to point a gun at each other, friends, as a joke or as a form of intimidation, which comes later on in the film, which is a really powerful scene. It's tragic, but I do agree with you. Like, there's 10 or 15 minutes I think you could have taken out of the first act that then could have been used to provide a lot of context and a lot of more, like, I find it really interesting that when he does finally find Steven, you get the traumatic scene of him reuniting with his wife again, Michael and Steven's wife, and she's just broken, a shell of a human being, can't even speak, barely can speak. But when he meets Steven, weren't you expecting there to be more scenes or just more interactions with those two men? It's like they have like one or two scenes with each other, and that's it. And then it goes back to him finding Nick.
Yeah, and it felt like maybe that it could have been like them talking about some of like how Steven could have integrated back home, trying to help him. It feels like they're trying to like cater to all these different things, and it's like as if Steven gets forgotten about within the film, and it sort of sucks because it's like you spend so much time establishing him, but then he's not fully developed. And I don't know if that's supposed to be kind of a commentary in and of itself of how not only are veterans treated, but veterans who are then disabled and can't, who have to deal with some of these like injuries that are completely life-changing. So I wonder if like maybe that was in there, but yeah, you do want more. And the third act of this film, it just, you're sort of like, okay, like what's next? Like what are we getting to? We got out of Vietnam, not like what are we leading back to? Where's Nick? And when we do get this, when Steven's like, yeah, I'm getting all this money, it leaves a lot of questions of like, how did Nick know to send it to there, first off?
Yeah.
Like how? You wonder, it would have made more sense if he was sending that money to where Angela was, but then they make her be in this catatonic state, which is like, why is she in a catatonic state? Is that just because she saw Steven and she freaked out, or did Steven say something? I wish we had like that moment where like if they saw each other and Steven like was freaking out at her over, maybe she came, visited, brought their son, and like saw him like that. But it's interesting.
I was gonna say, like, seeing his life in a way that we don't see, and I think so much of Best Years of Our Lives when we get to this third act, because it is reintegrating with the home life, but he doesn't show all of it in a way that I feel like we should. Especially, I mean, we get so much time with these characters in the first act. It's like, I think you said it perfectly. One scene of Steven's wife going to meet him, and maybe it's the first time she sees him like that. Maybe it's the first time his son, when she brings him in, sees him like that. Or we just get a scene of showing what it's like to be an amputee, both legs being lost, being in a wheelchair, adjusting to life. That sounds like it could take a lot of screen time, but I think one really solid scene of showing him in the same way that you do with Best Years of Our Lives could have gotten a lot more out of his character. And you're exactly right. His character does get forgotten in a way that feels intentional. And I don't really understand why that is, because his wedding the marriage, the setting up, all of that is so impactful in the first act. And I wonder if they just cut scenes just due to time because the film's already over 3 hours. But
which is unbelievable to like think about, because all you hear about is Cimino being like, no, we have to keep all of these scenes in.
Yeah, so maybe that's not the case. But I do think that is an issue with the movie, is that Steven kind of gets forgotten in a way that it's impactful because we know what's happened to him. We see his wife, and we know that Michael is distraught by the whole situation as well and tries to break him out of it. But I still think there could have been more to mine out of that, especially. But they focus on Nick's descent, and then Michael returning to Saigon and trying to find him.
Yeah, and before we even get back to Vietnam, there's one scene and moment that I would love to talk about, which is when they are back hunting. So actually two things. One, when they're back hunting and De Niro's character, Michael, does not shoot the deer.
Yes.
Has this huge buck right in eyesight and does not do anything about it. What do you think? Like, why do you think he held back there?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost, there's a lot of different ways you could look at it, right? I think you could look at it as his character not wanting to kill anymore. He's killed so many people, I would imagine, in the war. Just another casualty maybe doesn't feel worth it to him. I think you could look at it as a way of hunting isn't even the same anymore. There was like a ritualistic aspect to it. The concentration, waiting for your shot, taking your shot, coming back and getting the antlers or the head of the animal as a prize or a trophy. It's almost like that hobby has been kind of ruined for him, whether it's because it involves death or it involves guns and it takes him back there. It's so traumatic in a way that it's not right. Or is it because he's alone? Is it because he used to do this together with his community, his group of friends, and now he's just alone? It's not really the same anymore. So I think you could look at it as all three of those things really combined. But what do you think, Ben?
I think it's the not wanting to deal with violence, not wanting to be responsible for another death. Not seeing what's the point in me trying to kill this like creature? What am I getting out of this? So I think like that's why when he gets back and they're just playing with the gun, and this is the next thing I want to bring up with Stan, Axel, John, they're just like fucking around in this hut up in the mountains, and Stan's like whipping his little pistol around, like threatening people. And Michael just loses it. He goes into straight army mode, gets the gun in his hand, puts the bullet in, and does his own like Russian roulette with Stan. And a little bit of inside baseball backstory of that. De Niro and Cazale insisted on putting a live round into the gun. You didn't see this?
No.
Little fact. They insisted on putting a live round into the gun. And before every take, Cazale would make sure, looking into the chamber, that the next chamber was empty. But that the gun they would have and fling around at each other had a live round in it. Even
for the Russian roulette scene of him pulling the trigger?
When he pulls the trigger, when Mike pulls the trigger on Stan's head, that had a live round in it.
Well, that's so horrific and disturbing on so many levels.
I mean, yeah, it is. I guess you could say for Cazale, it's like, well, I'm going anyways.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if that was really sitting, but that's how method acting, how real they like were bringing, what they were bringing to their performances and the weight they were trying to bring in the atmosphere they were creating. So
a sense of realism.
I know it's not,
right. Like the weight of a gun with a bullet is a lot different than the weight of a gun without a single bullet.
And pulling a trigger, with it to your friend's head, you don't know if it's actually, I mean, they checked, they would say multiple times, make sure that wasn't the next bullet, chamber coming up. But yeah, it's pretty wild to think about, when because it's, Mike has a point where he's like, stop fucking around with this shit. Like, stop, like, because even in the beginning, like Stan is whipping the pistol around, trying to act all macho with it. So it's totally a commentary on machoism. But yeah, it's pretty fucking wild. It's cool, but it's also pretty intimidating and scary.
Well, it's the first time you see Michael snap in a way, right? You were watching Nick's descend into madness. We're seeing that clearly. Steven is kind of broken, and physically and mentally, it's ruined his life around him. But Michael has kind of returned home, and you're getting glimpses of it. it's almost like Linda almost comes on to him, like asks him to sleep with her basically, and he can't even do that. That's like a glimmer of how affected he is. He was in love with this woman, and now he can barely like even be in the same room with her. And then we get to this point where he's so broken that he's willing to like possibly murder his friend. Whether you think Michael knew that the next round wasn't or not, he spins the whole barrel or spins the whole chamber. So how would he really know if there's going to be a bullet there or not? It's like he just wanted to give Stan just a little second and glimmer into what it's like to be on the very edge of death, like not knowing. It's like he's so angry that he's able to wave this gun around, feel so confident and macho that he wants to take him down a peg in a very disturbing way. I'll do that next time I see you, Ben. I will have my gun brandished and one bullet.
As
ready.
long as we check the chamber to make sure it's not empty.
I'm spinning that bad boy.
Yeah, so it's pretty intense sequence. And then from there, getting close to the end here is this final Russian roulette scene where Michael, knows that Nick is still alive, goes to find him, finds him, and he cannot get through to Nick. Nick is hopped up on heroin. He's probably been shooting up for months. I don't even know how much time has truly passed, but I think it could have been a year, even 2 years since he last saw him. So and to think about that, Nick has been playing Russian roulette even for months, let alone years, and in a sense winning and not dying is pretty remarkable. He's just completely lost, and he tries to like get through to him. And in another like crazy acting moment, Cimino apparently told Walken to spit in De Niro's face when De Niro's sort of like Nick, like it's me, it's Mike, and Walken spits in his face, and De Niro did not know that was going to happen and rolled with it, but looked pretty pissed. And it looked like I've read that he was going to walk off the set after that had happened, but it was effective. It adds again another sense of like this like friendship being broken down bit by bit because of what they went through.
And that mirrors the Russian roulette moment where he tells the Thai actor to smack Walken in the face. It's almost like a brotherhood outside of the film as well. You can kind of see the camaraderie where it's really just about the art and getting the best, most authentic performance out of it. And man, it is tragic, that whole final moment. And it mirrors the scene as self-mirrors again. Obviously, you have the mention of the one shot. But when you look back at that first Russian roulette scene, what is Robert De Niro's character telling Christopher Walken or Nick? He's like, do it, do it, do it. He just keeps telling him to like pull the trigger, do it, because he needs to get to the gun to then kill the men and escape out of there. Now here we are. He's trying to save Nick, get him out of this horrible situation. And he's just begging him, don't do it, like over and over. It's again, mirrors the second act here where you first get introduced to the Russian roulette aspects of it. And I love that.
It's a good point.
Yeah, it really does mirror it in a really tragic way where he's begging for him, And it's so gross seeing his veins. He has all the dead veins in his arm, the makeup to show all of the dead veins that have died from heroin use. And like you said, that kind of also implies that he's been there for a long time and that Michael's been searching for Nick for a long time too, which makes it even more tragic when he sees him in the same exact situation that he left him in maybe a year ago.
Yeah, exactly. It's haunting, and I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know who was going to die, if they were both going to get out of there, if neither of them were going to get out of there, if Michael was going to have a secret like AK-47 hidden on him and like blowing up the place and guns ablazing. Like I had no idea what to expect. So yeah, when Nick dies, when he they're talking about the one shot, and it's sort of like, yeah, you remember me, buddy? It's like, yeah, and then boom, it's was like I remember my gut dropping the first time watching that, because I was like, no, like fuck, I did not expect that. And then looking back on it, you can kind of see the whole like special effects, like blood pack in his like little headband. It's so funny because you know what to look for, but and it's how fake it is, but it's pretty fucking graphic. And just one more thing, just before tossing it back to you, is Cimino's direction for that scene was it was one take, total improvisation, and he said, You put the gun to your head, Chris, you shoot, you fall over, and Bobby cradles your head. Otherwise, it was all improvised, those final moments, which is pretty fucking intense and wild.
I'm really glad you brought up the whole aspect of seeing the blood pack to a degree and being a little bit goofy. And it's such a hard thing to talk about, especially when you see people and have such a earnest reaction to this. And it's such a historic film at this point, specifically about the pains of the Vietnam War. And to call a moment that's very tragic and heartbreaking and, God, just great performances from both of these men, I have to admit it is a little goofy. It's a little, it's hard to say melodramatic because it's like the most extreme, horrific thing to happen, to watch your friend blow his brains out right in front of you and hold his hands. But here's the casualty of watching older films and seeing newer films before that. What film have I seen 10, maybe 20 times before this movie? Tropic Thunder. There is a very iconic scene very early on in the movie where Ben Stiller's character is like, has his arms blown off. I don't know if that's a reference to Platoon, but the way I see it, and especially after watching The Deer Hunter for the first time, the way Robert De Niro is like cradling his buddy as he's bleeding out and there's blood everywhere and it's horrific. It was so hard. My brain did go back to Tropic Thunder where he's like holding his dying buddy and it's goofy because you're seeing like his floppy, dead, broken, lost hands. And it's played up so much for jokes that it's hard because I've seen that movie and I love that movie. I don't even know some of the references there. And now seeing the reference, it's almost affected the way I feel about the original artwork, which is, it's tragic and it sucks. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this are going to be like, this guy's an idiot, calling this like heartbreaking, tragic moment in this film, the finale tragic moment, goofy. I can't help it. It does kind of bring me back to that moment. And as much as it's so powerful and heartbreaking, it's hard for me to fully get there and become emotional. And I see a lot of people describing how they bawl their eyes out and they get so teared up at this moment. And it's very powerful, but I just didn't get to that emotional length.
Yeah, I think it's emotional, but I feel like depending on the person, if you know, like us who were really into the actual filmmaking process and how did they do that, when it's so obvious like what they did, it's a little like, oh come on, like it's a little like hard to like pull yourself back into it because this is how they did it, so obvious. And it's not that it's like bad or poorly executed, it's just like what they had to use at the time. They don't have today's special effects, so it's just kind of a casualty of that. But it is a little goofy, but it is emotional too. Yeah. So I think you're still getting the emotions. You're just and they're conflicted by other things, and that's what happens. Yeah. And we don't really talk about it too often, but that's what happens when you watch films and you go back and you see the history as you're watching older films. And now when I go back and watch Tropic Thunder again, I'll probably get certain references that I never understood. So it's kind of a yin and yang of that. While it may affect some of these older films, I can still appreciate them and really see what they were going for. And I love that it does feel so authentic and real. It's just him begging for it, begging. It doesn't feel like a script at all. It does feel completely authentic and real. So it is heartbreaking in that sense. And I think what's more heartbreaking to me is returning home, trying to get back after maybe Michael at this point has kind of recovered a little bit. We don't see that, but you have to imagine how much time has passed, that Michael's definitely doing a little bit better than he was at home. I think the last puzzle piece was just finding Nick. So then when you find Nick and it's just horrific ending to his story, how broken is Michael? And how broken is he now that he has to return home again to people that just will never understand what it was like to be there? So speaking of going home, I think we can wrap it up here with the final scene of the movie, which is Nick's funeral. You know, his friends bury him. It's very sad. They're back in the small town. It's another like just beautiful looking day, like fall day, but with a lot of sadness. And then they return to this bar that John operates, and it's quiet. It's very subtle. And the thing that they then do is they start singing God Bless America. John starts humming it while he's cooking, and then they all join in, and the movie ends on a freeze frame of them singing it and a photo from the wedding, and it's just the end. So before just giving our thoughts on it, Cimino spoke about his intentions for the scene because a lot of people had some issues with it, of using God Bless America because they thought it was being anti-patriotic, anti-America. And so Cimino said the ending is really not meant to be so much a statement of patriotism, but a statement of communion. when people are in trouble, as they are when they're very troubled and sick inside, spiritually very sick, they need sometimes to do something together. In this case, it's make a sound. And they sing that song because it's a song that every American child knows by heart because you're taught it in school. Everybody knows the words of God Bless America. And so it's a communal sound. And they had to sing the one song they all know from grade school. And you never forget those words as long as you live. And so they sing the one song they happen to know happens to be God Bless America and reunites them as a family. It becomes a family communion instead of a Last Supper. It becomes a first breakfast, if you will, of a new family. It is breakfast and they're eating. It's not the Last Supper. It's the first breakfast. So kind of repetitive in what he has to say. But it's just that emphasis of like, it's a new beginning. It's a coming up together of, of their relation to Nick and how even though there's a sadness and a void of his death, there's still something that they can like bond together and get through. So I see that and I feel those emotions. Although, why did it have to be God Bless America? Like, it feels like almost as if Cimino did use that as a comment on patriotism, heard the response back, how negative it was, and then I was like, no. It's totally something different. So what do you think, John? If you're a director, would you have picked this song? Would you pick another song?
Well, let's go through it. I mean, he says it straightforward. It's a song that everyone knows. What are American songs that everyone knows? And I'm not talking pop culture. I'm talking about historically American songs that everyone knows. God Bless America. The Pledge of Allegiance. What are songs that Americans know by heart?
Well, they all knew Can't Take My Eyes Off of You. So I wonder if like even that had been the song to use as a callback.
Like playing the same exact song from the first.
Yeah.
Okay.
If they were all singing Can't Take My Eyes Off of You.
That almost feels too romantic, in a way. But I do understand the parallel, the mirroring. We get that throughout the film a lot, right? So it wouldn't be too crazy to mirror that. But to me, because he said that, and I only know that because I've done some research beside that, but it's interesting because you can look at it a lot of different ways, because obviously it could sound like a very patriotic moment, but it's almost like heartbreaking. And he almost sees it as like a restart. It was really interesting to see him describe it as, it's not the Last Supper. This isn't the Last Supper that these people are having and they're going to die or they're going to go through a tragedy. This is what he called the first breakfast. They're sitting down to eat breakfast together and they're trying to like restart their life, basically. I don't know if that means restart it with a sense of patriotism and a sense of normalcy, which I think you could look at it that way. But I think it really comes down to the way you describe it. It's a song that everyone knows. I don't know if you could just start belting a famous pop song. They are listening to that in the bar. Like, you're right, that it would be a mirroring of the first act, but they're listening to the song. It's not like something that just comes naturally and one of the characters starts singing it. There is some context, I think, to the environment with the bar playing the song. So I think it's really powerful. And I don't look at it as like a go America or even anti-America. I have that understanding because Cimino has basically told me that, and that understanding of, he thinks it's not that, it's just something that we can all relate to and understand. And we're all just looking for a sense of community, especially after something so horrific. It's hard not to look at something like 9/11 because that is our true horrific American moment that we look at. And we always talk about how patriotic we were as Americans after that happened because we grouped together. I remember seeing the American flag everywhere growing up around that time from like the early 2000s because it became even more powerful to like show and be patriotic and American. I just think this is a song that we just know by heart, and they're not going to sing the Pledge of Allegiance all together. So what do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have like a song necessarily in mind, but I was thinking about the Frankie Valli song and just, hey, maybe if when they're cooking and they started humming that, like maybe that could have been a nice little like fun sense of relief. But this is a kind of communal thing. It's that grade school aspect of like, they're all going through something so traumatic and sad that it's almost bringing it back to that basic level. Could have been how they approached it. So I don't truly know, but it's definitely an interesting ending to a movie that I didn't think it had a political message until like that happened. I don't think there's any commentary on America. If anything, it's like almost about, it felt like about the American experience of immigrants coming to this country, establishing a community that's like similar to the one they had back at their original like homeland, and then having a fight for it. But then, having this, it's a little strange, but it makes sense, Cimino's explanation. But I also understand the criticism of like why people necessarily don't like
them being Russian American too plays into a factor. I mean, even when Nick is being interviewed or kind of diagnosed by the doctor in the hospital, when we first kind of get to catch up with him again after the traumatic events, he denies his Russian American background. It's almost like he doesn't even want to be associated with that. He wants to be seen as just American. And that's kind of like an under theme throughout the movie, is like, what does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be patriotic in a way? But I think it's really powerful. I think it's one of the most powerful moments in the entire film, because it's this reprieve of just, there's nothing left. Like, our lives are forever changed. It's kind of like how we approach this and are affected by this. So I found it really interesting. And that was a great quote that you found from him. There's another really great quote, because I think a lot of people look at this as being specifically just a Vietnam story. And I think it's a good quote that could kind of help like wrap us up with the Deer Hunter in this worthy episode. So Cimino in this interview said no, because he was asked directly, is this film about the Vietnam experience, or was it more about community and the American experience? And he said, no, it's not about Vietnam at all. Vietnam is a part of it, but it's nothing like Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse Now is a movie about the Vietnam War, centered in Vietnam specifically. This is a story about social outcasts in a small town who form a kind of nuclear family of their own. As people who are outcasts generally do, it's the story of what happens to this family when traumatic events take place in their lives, how it affects them, their relationships, and their lives as individuals and as a group. So I found that to be very powerful, because that is the diagnosis of this film, right? It's a depiction of reality taking place. And I think a lot of people can relate to this, because they've all seen the way it's kind of affected them. They've seen the way that people around them have changed. And now at this point in time, we've seen how the whole country was kind of changed by the Vietnam War and the tragedies and the horrific nature of them. I mean, we don't even get to the protesting and all the kind of anti-war sentiment that you see throughout history, and that you see in a lot of World War or Vietnam films. You know, the hippie protests and putting a flower in the barrel of a gun, all these things that you kind of signify with being anti-war. And the film's not about that. I think the film is truly about trauma and the affliction of trauma on a group of people, and a group of people that is kind of the way he describes it, nuclear family. There is no like mom or dad. We get barely any glimpse of the parents in these people's lives, besides Linda and her abusive father. General thoughts to wrap this up, Ben. I thought that was a really interesting way of kind of looking at the whole film. It's not a Vietnam story. It's more about trauma and the effects of trauma on a family.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's exactly what I took away from the film itself. What, that it's about a before and after of what these people were like before they went through this, and then after, how it impacted them, the torture they went through, how they had to experience something that they, in their small town in PA, probably would have never had to have experienced, which in a way, I guess, is then appropriate to say God bless America, because if they weren't in America, they wouldn't be as safe,
Yeah.
They could have, I guess it's like another commentary on like why using that song was, appropriate. So it's very interesting. I think it almost feels like a very quick ending. Very like stark and compared to the rest of the movie, but I think it appropriately ties it all up. I think it's all about the journey throughout the film, like what you're supposed to experience and take away. Especially the acting performances. I love De Niro in this role. I think it's like one of his better roles, and it's a role that I don't think many people bring up when they talk about like what's a great De Niro performance. But this one I truly enjoyed. I enjoyed all of them. So yeah, those are kind of my final thoughts of the film. John, do you have anything else before we get into the 51st Academy Awards?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think all the performances are just outstanding. I think it's why the film works as well as it does. I think the film would feel so much longer if you had any bad egg of an actor in here. But there's not a single character that doesn't feel real or authentic. Every actor that's placed in a role feels authentic in a way that kind of builds up this reality, and it feels like a true small town. Like I said, I'm from Pennsylvania. I've lived here most of my life, and it does feel very authentic in that way of a small town, not knowing what it's really like to be out of your town. I imagine that a lot of these characters maybe have never left their hometown in their entire lives, maybe to go hunting, leave town a little bit, but never really leave the state or the general region that they're from. And we see the impact that has, because it's the most extreme way to be taken from your home country and then to be returned as if nothing were to happen. So I think A Deer Hunter is a very beautifully profound film that is sometimes a little too on the nose, but it's handled with such grace when it comes to the performances that it kind of overcomes those issues.
Let's jump into the 51st Academy Awards.
Now we're in the plaza of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion of the Music Center in Los Angeles, California, where crowds have been gathering since early morning to witness the arrival of the most glamorous names in the movie industry.
The Academy is proud to welcome Mr. Johnny Carson.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Howard, thank you for the very flattering remarks. Before we begin tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say for the record that I am in favor of using more American Indians and other minorities in motion pictures. I am against polluting the oceans of the world. I'm for every nationality having its own homeland. I'm against whacking baby seals on the head, and I'm for saving the whales. And now, thank you, I've never received a squatting ovation before. As you well know by now, this is the 51st Annual Academy Awards. 2 hours of sparkling entertainment spread out over a 4-hour show. Now, a lot of people who come to these affairs try to act blasé, and I'll have to be very honest with you. I am very thrilled to stand up here tonight and gaze out on this glorious throng of beautiful people. I see a lot of new faces, especially on the old faces. Mr. Chu, come out here, please.
各位，呢個荷里活真係講唔得笑。男仔中意女仔，女仔又中意男仔。不過佢哋情場失意，大打官司，女仔贏咗，男仔破產。多謝各位。
Now, I realize that means absolutely nothing to you, but right now, Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping in China is hysterical. Now, as you know, ladies and gentlemen, there has been some criticism of the Academy, and especially of this telecast, that it is rather a frivolous, cheap commercial exploitation. That is not true. And I will discuss this in greater detail following the swimsuit competition between Laurence Olivier and John Voight. I want to thank the Academy for inviting me to be your host this evening. I hope you're all relaxed now, so let's settle back and all enjoy the program together. Thank you very much.
The 51st Academy Awards were held on April 9th, 1979 at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles, California. This year's Oscars were hosted by Johnny Carson. This is the first time Carson took on the role of Master of Ceremonies, a position he would reprise 4 more times in the years to come. This was the first of 3 Academy Awards telecasts to have 2 musical directors, being Jack Elliott and Alan Ferguson, and the other 2 being the 72nd Academy Awards and the 84th Academy Awards. So you can get much of a musical flair. The spinning sets, the kind of like cake tier spinning sets, takes me back to Broadway Melody when you watch some of the old segments from the 51st Academy Awards. You also have singers Sammy Davis Jr. and Steve Lawrence, who performed a melody called Oscar's Only Human, composed of movie songs that were not nominated for Best Original Songs. Initially, the Academy's music branch protested the segment, and it was urged that it be dropped from the ceremony, but it was kept after Haley threatened to leave his position as a producer and pulled Carson from the hosting duties. So here we have a moment of the Academy trying to avoid issues, something that we'll see continuously over and over again, trying to not be political, but is still yet very political. And then we also have a moment in the very opening where George Chung, who's a Chinese actor, comes out and speaks Mandarin. and what I'm assuming is real sentences, a real Mandarin. I don't really know because it's not shown in subtitles. It's kind of a joke about him speaking in Chinese. And I think there's some context I don't really understand about the time, or maybe there's some sort of Chinese event that happened that I just really don't understand. But what I found interesting about this, one, it clearly seems kind of like a racist joke. That's not very new for the Academy Awards. That's kind of been a thing. But here we are. They seem like they're progressing. You have more African Americans winning, more representation, yet here we are still kind of mocking Chinese actors. George Chung was a working actor at the time. He's in the second Rambo film, I think is what he's most known for. But what I found also really interesting is that later, George Chung is still alive, and when Everything Everywhere All at Once won recently for Best Picture, he was just elated and spoke about how it was so amazing seeing Asians on stage and winning Oscars. So I think it's a full kind of big circle that we see with George Chung. And a lot of people don't even, I tried to even look up more about this, like what he's saying, if it's ever been translated. I didn't really know how to translate it myself, but I'm so curious to know what that kind of moment of Chinese is in the opening ceremony. And if that's actually real, is it just a joke? I don't know, but I found it very interesting. That being said, Ben, what do you think about our boy Johnny Carson, one of the most famous, if not the most famous late night host of all time, being the master of ceremonies for the 51st Academy Awards?
Yeah, it feels sort of like cool. Like, I don't know. I didn't think that he did anything too crazy. I think like his monologue felt very, late night scripted.
Definitely.
And yeah, so it's just sort of like, okay, cool. Like, thanks Johnny for coming in to like fill in for this time around. So I didn't think it was like anything too special. I don't know. What did you think? I thought the joke that you're talking about was like, wow, that's, racy. It's funny, but it's a little racy.
Yeah, really odd. I think I'm definitely missing some context if anyone knows and can fill us in a little bit. I thought you're so right. It felt very late night opening monologue. I think what came with that is a lot more racy jokes. I'm not even talking about the Chung joke, but there's my favorite joke, I think, of the opening ceremonies is Carson saying that there's a lot of new faces in the crowd, and most of them are old faces, as in implying that a lot of the older people in the audience have had plastic surgery, which I found very interesting. Like, what was plastic surgery in the 70s? I don't really want to know, but I found that very interesting.
Not good.
Yeah, not good, right? And that's kind of the joke. And that kind of precedes, I mean, obviously the Oscars have had a history of poking fun at themselves, poking fun at the actors, but this almost feels like a step up. You're making fun of their appearances, calling people out as if they've had too much plastic surgery. I thought that was a really funny joke, and we will definitely see that continue in the Oscars.
So moving on to some of the honorary awards of the evening. First, a Special Achievement Award went to Les Bowie, Colin Chilvers, Dennis Koop, Roy Field, Derek Meddings, and Zoran Perisic for the visual effects of Superman. So Steve Martin presented the Oscar this year, and a little funny moment, he had a chroma keyed mask on, so he appears headless with an arrow going through his head. But the movie Superman is directed by Richard Donner, revolutionized visual effects by making audiences believe a man could fly. Their work included groundbreaking techniques in wire rigging, compositing, and miniature models, setting a new benchmark for practical effects in the superhero genre and beyond. John, I know you love Superman and probably these visual effects, so I'll let you have the floor here to pontificate and ooze and gush over
Absolutely. I find, just like Worthy always is, we hit something and then somehow it mirrors itself, like the Deer Hunter. In 2025, we're relaunching the DC Cinematic Universe with Superman. And I find that so interesting. We're kind of rebooting it in a way that kind of honors the classic. But to honor Richard Donner now here in 2025 with this new Superman film, and then looking back at all and seeing the new special effects and thinking about the amazing work that they did here, it truly changed the way people saw special effects. And maybe this is the reason why down the line we do get to the moment where we see its own category being formed. I think Superman, when you look at it now, it's kind of rough when you're talking about special effects, but at the time it was truly mind-blowing. And I still think there's moments in that movie where it does feel like a man can fly. and it's really powerful. And I just wanted to include that little Steve Martin bit because it was very goofy. And I was like, whoa, a chroma keyed moment of just the Oscars in 1978-9. Like, it felt out there. And I was like, when is that? When's the first time that's ever happened? Turns out it was 20 years prior, in 1957. They did the first like chroma key or green screening in live TV. I thought that was going to be way later. So I was kind of surprised by that and found that very interesting. Moving to the Jean Hersholt Humanitarian Award, which went to Leo Jaffe. Jaffe was recognized for his generosity and significant contributions to philanthropy, particularly in supporting arts and education. Jaffe was a producer and executive at Columbia Pictures. Jaffe even played a crucial role in shaping the studio's golden years, with an emphasis on fostering talent and community.
Yeah, he definitely had a few young girls in his office or two. Okay. All right. So Academy Honorary Awards this evening also included one to Laurence Olivier, was recognized for the full body of his work for the unique achievements of his entire career and his lifetime contribution to the art of film. Another one went to Walter Lantz, who was celebrated for bringing joy and laughter to every part of the world through his unique animated motion pictures. Actually, one thing I really liked with this was the Woody Woodpecker like animation that they had, and they had Robin Williams like part of it, who was like just coming up with they were like, and then Popeye coming next year. It felt like one of those like, here's a big studio movie that we have coming. We're going to promote. It's going to
be the biggest, most successful movie of all time.
Yeah. So it's very much like that. Like when Oscars were shoving Halle Bailey down our throat for fucking Little Mermaid.
God, they
like
tried.
3 years out before. It was so bad. Moving on, some other honorary awards went to King Vidor for his incomparable achievements as a cinematic creator and innovator. And the last one was given to the Museum of Modern Art Department of Film for their recognition for its dedication to preserving and promoting the art of film and sharing its cultural significance for future generations.
Best film editing went to Peter Zinner for The Deer Hunter. This is Zinner's first Academy Award of 3 total nominations, and he was previously nominated for Best Film Editing for The Godfather in 1973. Ben, we didn't talk too much about the editing. Obviously, we talked about the pacing, which is somewhat responsible for the editing and the long pace, the 3 hours and 3 minutes that we feel. But what did you feel about the overall editing of The Deer Hunter?
Well, I think the editing and the pacing is kind of what saves the film from its 3 hour runtime, where it doesn't feel, it feels like they're able to balance so much, but it doesn't feel like it was, there's like anything like unwise or like unneeded with the edits. Like it all works. So if you were to like take anything away, you just take away a chunk of the movie. But I thought otherwise it balanced it all pretty perfectly. So I thought it was a well edited film. I had no issues with it.
Yeah, extremely well edited, especially when it comes to just dialogue scenes and keeping the pacing. These long moments of these characters interacting, or sometimes characters just reacting to other characters' speeches. And there's just some amazing reaction shots in this movie. And obviously we talked about the grand open vistas that they kind of like linger on and hold, and you get to kind of like appreciate the beauty. And then there's a chaotic nature of Vietnam and just the never ending and the fast pace of Vietnam I thought was really engaging and interesting.
Best cinematography went to Nestor Almendros for Days of Heaven. This is Almendros' first Academy Award out of 4 total nominations. Just some more little background onto the actual production of Days of Heaven. So due to union regulations, Almendros was not allowed to operate the camera. Director Terrence Malick, him and Almendros would plan out and rehearse the cameras and the actors' movements. Almendros would stand near the main camera and give instructions to the operators. And I think you would like this part in particular. So Almendros was gradually losing sight by the time the shootings began. So to elevate his setups, he had one of his assistants take Polaroids of the scene, then examine them through powerful glasses, according to this. So it looked like, I looked at some stills and some quick shots of Days of Heaven. Looks pretty beautiful. So I'm not like upset because The Deer Hunter also looks amazing. And The Deer Hunter, we didn't speak about how wide, the widescreen aspect of the film and just how big it truly felt. But it's okay. It could look like Days of Heaven looked pretty damn good.
Yeah.
Visually
Yeah.
speaking.
I think there's a sense of realism that almost is almost a detriment when it comes to the cinematography. It's a little muddy at times, and they try to make that contrast between the kind of like dark and stormy atmosphere of this Pennsylvania town, switching over to the beautiful mountains. That's Pennsylvania in quotes. And then of course to the lush jungles, and then back into, there is like huge difference between the way the jungles and the Vietnam sequences are shot versus the way that you're even interacting with these characters in like Saigon per se. So there's some really interesting cinematography. I think it is kind of muddy, and it's not as pretty if you're looking and comparing it, especially to Days of Heaven, which is like a gorgeous film. And Terrence Malick is just a master when it comes to visuals. Best art direction went to Heaven Can Wait. Art direction by Paul Silbert, Edwin O'Donovan, set decoration by George Gaines. This is Silbert and O'Donovan's first Academy Award wins. George Gaines won his second Oscar after previously winning for All the President's Men in 1977.
Best costume design went to Anthony Powell for Death on the Nile. This is Powell's second of 3 career Academy Award wins in Best Costume Design. He previously won for Travels with My Aunt from 1972, and he will go on to win the following ceremony for Tess from 1979. And also for this category, it was presented by Jack Haley. So a little bit about just the ceremony and this moment. It was presented by Jack Haley, who was the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, and he presented the award with Ray Bolger, who played the Scarecrow. Another little similarity to this year in Wicked.
Yeah, absolutely. Best sound went to The Deer Hunter. Richard Portman, William McKay, Aaron Rochin, and Darren Knight. This is Portman's first win of 11 nominations, Macaulay's first win of 5 total nominations, Rochin's first win of 9 total nominations, and Knight's first win and only nomination. Rochin's Oscar statue was actually blemished upon the time of delivering it to him, so it was replaced with a temporary award whilst the original was repaired. However, the original was stolen and never recovered. In 2011, a man was charged with selling a stolen Oscar statue that might have been Rochin's original. The Deer Hunter was Cimino's first film to use the Dolby noise reduction system. What Dolby does, replied Cimino, is to give you the ability to create a density of detail of sound, a richness so you can demolish the wall separating the viewer from the film. You can come close to demolishing the screen. It took 5 months to mix the soundtrack. One short battle sequence, 200 feet of film in the final cut, took 5 days to dub. Another sequence recreated the 1975 American evacuation of Saigon. Cimino brought the film's composer, Stanley Myers, out to the location to listen to the auto, tank, and jeep horns as the sequence was being photographed. The result, according to Cimino, Myers composed the music for that scene in the same key as the horn sounds, so the music and the sound effects would blend with the images to create one jarring, desolate experience. Ben, I didn't even notice this. So as a sound and music guy, how do you feel about the sound in The Deer Hunter?
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting because it at times I think it does fall into like the 70s sort of like here's new technology, but we don't fully know how to use it because still some of the sound doesn't feel as dynamic. Now I'm not watching it with Dolby. I wonder if I watched it in a Dolby theater if I would feel like what they were trying to present. But I still think it's like a pretty powerful, sound mixing. There's a lot that they have to capture, a lot of differences. Again, I talked about before about how when they were up in the mountains first hunting, there was just this like almost this vacuum of like sound just taken out where it's just so silent, but they're surrounded by so much. And so I guess like that adds to it where they really hone in and focus and create this structure of sound that, is pretty massive and big. And also just, the music is sort of separate, but I think they use music pretty effectively throughout the film when it was like interspersed.
Yeah, absolutely. Very powerful because it's used sparingly.
Best original song went to Last Dance from Thank God It's Friday. Music and lyrics by Paul Jabara. This is Jabara's first and only Academy Award win. According to the song's arranger, Bob Esty, Paul Jabara had locked Donna Summer in a Puerto Rico hotel bathroom and forced her to listen to a cassette of him singing a rough version of Last Dance. Summer liked the song, and Jabara asked Etsy to work with him on an arrangement for Summer to make her recording. So we all know the song Last Dance, but let's play it anyways.
So let's dance, let's dance, let's dance, let's dance, let's dance, let's dance tonight. Let's dance for love.
I had no idea this was an Oscar song.
Me
I had to
neither.
be quite honest. When I was like looking up, I'm like, Last Dance. Like, I wonder if like that's the
Same song.
I'm
Yeah.
thinking of.
Last
And when I Googled it and pulled up on YouTube, I was like, let's fucking go. Like, fucking raging.
That's so funny because
Like, of course.
up until this moment, I always assumed that song was just called Let's Dance. Let's dance.
Same.
Really?
Same.
Okay. Let's dance. I'm like, okay.
Tonight.
Also, what's an acoustic version of that? It's probably horrible. There's like, it's all about the music in that song.
Last Dance. It's really slow
Yeah,
and
slow.
somber. But yeah, it's so
slow
awesome.
and somber. Yeah. Best adaptation score went to Joe Renzetti for the Buddy Holly story. This is Renzetti's first and only Academy Award win.
Best original score went to Midnight Express, composed by Giorgio Moroder. This is Moroder's first of 3 career Academy Award wins. He would go on to win for Best Original Song for Flashdance, What a Feeling from Flashdance, 1984, and Take My Breath Away from Top Gun, 1987. Dubbed the father of disco, Moroder is credited with pioneering Euro disco and electronic dance music. His work with synthesizers had a significant influence on several music genres, such as high energy, Italo disco, synth pop, new wave, house, and techno music. I gotta say, John, when I watched Midnight Express, I was like, man, this is great, scoring. And like literally thought to myself, I'm like, it would be really cool if like this had like won like best score because like syntho and like synth like music and like really like spacey. And then I'm like, oh my God, it actually did win. That's fucking amazing.
It's nuts. And it's a stacked year too. Ennio Morricone and John Williams for the Superman score. Like huge. And to beat that, Midnight Express, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but it is an experience. Let me tell you that. It's definitely worth the watch.
Yeah, definitely. And very good score.
Best animated short film went to Special Delivery by Eunice Macaulay and John Weldon.
Best live action short film went to Taylor Hackford for Teenage Father.
Best documentary short subject went to The Flight of the Gossamer Condor by Jacqueline Phillips Shed and Ben Shed.
Best documentary feature went to Scared Straight to Arnold Shapiro. So the subject of the documentary is a group of juvenile delinquents and their 3-hour session with actual convicts. Filmed at Rahway State Prison in New Jersey, a group of inmates known as the Lifers berate, scream at, and terrify the young offenders in an attempt to scare them straight so that those teenagers will avoid prison life. It found that most of the participants did not reoffend. However, studies that compared and evaluated the effects of various Scared Straight programs against a control group have concluded that they increased the likelihood of participants later committing crimes. So I just thought it was like really funny that like one of those documentaries, there's only Scared Straight, won an Oscar when they're just like trying to like scare kids to be like, you can't do this, don't do this shit.
I know a couple people in Raleigh, Best foreign language film went to France for Get Out Your Handkerchiefs. This is the 11th French film to win Best Foreign Language International Feature Film out of 12 total wins.
Best Screenplay based on material from another medium went to Midnight Express to Oliver Stone, based on the book by Billy Hayes and William Hoffer. This is Stone's first of 3 Academy Award wins and only win as a writer. The original author, Billy Hayes, around whom the film is set, said the film's depiction of prison conditions was accurate. Hayes said that the message of Midnight Express isn't "don't go to Turkey," it's "don't be an idiot like I was and try to smuggle drugs." Oliver Stone later apologized to Turkey for over-dramatizing the script while standing by the film's stark depiction of the brutality of Turkish prisons. John, as we mentioned briefly before, Midnight Express, we both watched this film to gear up for this episode. What are some takeaways you have from Midnight Express that we can apply here?
I think out of the Best Picture nominations, it is the most modern feeling, I would say. It has a very rapid pace. It feels like it could be like I described to you, Darren Aronofsky film, Requiem for a Dream, or even like a Safdie brothers film, if you want to go even more modern. It has a very, you're falling down the rabbit hole vibe, and it is very dark, disturbing, and honestly, I was so disturbed by it that I was shocked that it was from 1978. Like, I couldn't believe it. I was so shocked that it was a movie that was as old as it was, because it didn't feel that way. Obviously, the aesthetic of it and everything, but it is a very great film, and it's very well written and extremely emotional. So definitely worth the time.
But yeah, I agree here. I agree here with Midnight Express and kind of your sentence of it. It's such a bizarre film that it just, like, watching it, I didn't really know what to expect. You were just like, you should watch this movie. And I'm like, okay, all right, fine, I'll check it out. And then I was like, what the fuck? It's really good, really fucked up, but also not like the most compelling, but at the same time, pretty dark and like easy to get like lost in. And you're like kind of on the edge of your seat the entire time. You're like, what's going to happen? Like, how is he gonna like survive this prison? How is he gonna do this and do? It's a very good movie, and again, like what we mentioned before about the score, it's really good, and just the fact that like Oliver Stone wrote it. I mean, it's one of those like, wow, that's like really interesting and cool.
He's so young, like it's shocking to see him that way. You know. Whew.
Moving on to best screenplay written directly for the screen went to Coming Home, story by Nancy Dowd, screenplay by Waldo Salt and Robert C. Jones. This is Dowd's first Academy Award, Salt's second Academy Award, previously won for Best Adapted Screenplay for Midnight Cowboy, and this is Jones's first Academy Award after having previously been nominated 3 times for Best Film Editing. So yeah, John, so we have Deer Hunter here nominated but did not win. Do you think Deer Hunter should have won over Coming Home?
Coming Home is interesting. We didn't get to watch it because it's like not available anywhere online, unfortunately. You can buy it, but that's about it. So it's kind of frustrating that that's the way it is. But in terms of the writing, I don't think so. I mean, we've learned that there's a lot of improv when it comes to this film. There's iconic scenes that we know were changed or improv in the moment. So no, I wouldn't really push it over any other film. It's hard to know. And it seems like there was a lot kind of like happening and being molded on screen. Plus you have some great actors. So maybe some of the major winning elements of this film is not really credited to the writing itself. Best Supporting Actress went to Maggie Smith for California Suite as Diana Barry. This is Maggie Smith's second Academy Award win and first for Best Supporting Actress. She previously won Best Actress for The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie from 1969. The Best Supporting Actress winner, Maggie Smith, became the only person to win an Oscar for playing an Oscar loser in California Suite. You could also count Renee Zellweger for her role as Judy Garland, but Garland did receive an Academy Juvenile Award. That's really interesting, Ben. I need to watch California Suite then. Have you seen California Suite yet?
Yeah. No, I have not, but Professor McGonagall winning her second Oscar, you know, I'm sure she's good, but that seems like kind of like an ensemble anthology film. But I thought it was interesting that they're like, oh, she won for playing someone who's lost an Oscar. And then I thought to myself, I'm like, but didn't that happen? And it sort of did with with Renee Zellweger, but Judy Garland, I guess, got an Oscar Juvenile Award. We're going to count that, right?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So moving on to Best Supporting Actor went to Christopher Walken for The Deer Hunter and I'm going to say the whole name. Let's see if I can
You
get
got
this
this.
right. Corporal Nicanor Nick Chevaradovich.
Oh, that was amazing, man.
Is that? I think I got it.
Nail on
Anyway,
the head, brother.
If you ask me, I think if you ask me to spell Chevaradovich, I cannot do it. Well, this is Walken's first and only Academy Award win, and I found this surprising. He would only go on to be nominated once more in his career for Catch Me If You Can for Best Supporting Actor. I thought for sure there might have been like another couple, like one or two, like Best Acting nominations, but yeah, this is his first nomination, his only win. Only got one more nomination. That's it. And for a role I absolutely loved in this movie, I thought it worked brilliantly. So I'm a big fan of Walken in this performance. I think we gushed about it before, but yeah, I mean, he went toe to toe with De Niro in many scenes, and I thought he carried himself very well with it.
And he's just so different. I think he feels very unique. I watched him on the Dick Cavett show, which is amazing. Again, if you haven't watched clips, if you're a big fan of just old interviews or just seeing actors or actresses or directors, go watch Dick Cavett's YouTube channel. There's so many good clips. But I watched him being interviewed, I think in the early 80s, I would say, maybe mid 80s, just about leaving school. He left in the middle of a psychology class to go be in a film. He was in the middle of college courses and he just knew that he wanted to change everything in his life and just left to go be in a film, and everything kind of changed. And this wasn't soon after where he was in The Deer Hunter. He is just such a unique actor. Not to pull in another actor, but I recently saw a clip of Josh Brolin talking about how there's good actors that are famous and there's great actors that aren't famous. And there's also people that just are famous or well known because they're very interesting and they're just unique. And I think Christopher Walken is a good actor, but I think he's just very unique. So especially when you haven't seen him before, there is an off-kilter aspect to him. He's like a soft, gentle, big man in the very beginning, but there is like a coldness behind his eyes. I just think purely as a human, he's very interesting, like open, kind of big eyes that are very expressive and can be very scary at times. And to seeing his transformation in this movie, I think the first time I watched it, I didn't appreciate it as much until the second time I watched it. It felt like the transition almost happened too suddenly. But when you pay close attention to the way Nick is in the encampment scene, the first Russian roulette whole segment, you can watch him basically falling apart as a human, basically throughout that whole scene, and not just the Russian roulette scene, the entire scene of them being kind of kept prisoner. It's Michael who's leading everyone. Steven is the first person to break, but it's Nick who's mentally, he's more quiet, but he's mentally like absolutely falling apart. And then it's when the actual game happens that kind of truly breaks him. So well deserved, but I did think the same thing when you said that. And I think it's mainly because Walken, he does a lot of interesting films, and sometimes they're not ever going to be in line of like that kind of Oscar or that kind of worthy caliber. He also does a lot of genre films as well. So he's an interesting guy. I think he's very expressive and goofy, and he works for very particular roles, is how I feel about Christopher Walken. Best Actress went to Jane Fonda for Coming Home as Sally Hyde. This is Fonda's second Academy Award win for Best Actress, and she previously won for Clute in 1973. Fonda begins her speech at the Academy Awards by signing, acknowledging the 14 million deaf individuals worldwide whom she refers to as the, quote, invisible handicapped. If you want to say, upon its release, the film emerged as a major commercial success with audiences and received positive reviews from critics. Ebert noted that her Sally Hyde was, the quote, the kind of character you somehow wouldn't expect the outspoken, intelligent Fonda to play. Who doesn't love Jane Fonda? She's truly a prize in this beautiful country of ours, and I love her, and my fiance knows a good amount of signing, and it was a really cool moment to see that. And again, that's something that's come full circle recently with a recent Best Picture winner. And I love that. And you were seeing like an early glimpse at that. And Fonda is just the perfect human being. Just the best.
Just wish I could watch Coming Home on
I know.
easily
We're
accessible
gonna have to buy it.
way. And wait for it to get shipped and to get a Blu-ray player, DVD player. Moving on to Best Actor went to Jon Voight for Coming Home as Luke Martin. This is Voight's first and only Academy Award win. He was previously nominated for Midnight Cowboy in the same category. He would go on to be nominated for Runaway Train and for Best Actor in '86, and then Best Supporting Actor for Ali in 2002. So Voight is a person that we gushed over in Midnight Cowboy, thought he should have won there. How do you feel about De Niro not winning here?
Oh man, it's interesting. I find his character fascinating, and it's a lot more subtle, obviously, than a Steven. Christopher Walken as Nick as well is just completely not subtle as well, and that's not a bad thing. I think it's appropriate for their character and for the performance. It's what it's needed. You just got a performance that's front and center. I think more than Michael. Screen time is shared across a lot of these characters. I think Michael is the main character, of course, but the screen time is split between a lot of these characters, which takes time away from a character, and I think that can obviously impact the way it's kind of depicted in the Academy and the way they feel when it comes to the Best Actor. And you got Jon Voight at the center of Coming Home, playing a very important figure. And it's why Jane Fonda highlighted the handicap community, because she said in her speech that she learned so much from making Coming Home and the struggles and how many Americans are affected by this, whether it's from war injuries or birth injuries or just being, afflicted in some way with a disability. So Coming Home, I think, was a huge, impactful film for the time. It was a huge box office success. And Jon Voight just continues to rise as a huge star. I mean, he's got so much chemistry and he's so handsome. It's hard not to see that. And that's not to say, all these other amazing actors, Laurence Olivier, Robert De Niro, Gary Busey, and Warren Beatty. I mean, iconic. But I think it was finally Jon Voight's time, and that also plays into it. I think Midnight Cowboy probably continued to stay in people's minds as well. Best Director went to Michael Cimino for The Deer Hunter. This is Cimino's first of 2 Academy Awards of the evening and his first Academy Award win. Of course, the one and only Francis Ford Coppola presented the Best Director Award tonight. And if you look closely, you'll notice something is maybe a bit funky about the way Francis Ford Coppola is acting. And for a long time, I think it was unclear why he was acting the way he was. And he went on a rambly, yet I thought pretty profound speech, as Francis Ford Coppola often does. So let's take a little listen, and I'll give you a little bit more context.
In America, he's called the director, but in other countries he has a different name. The French call him réalisateur. Italians call him regista. It translates the realizer, the one who realizes the dream.
Actually, whatever you call it, the job is to make dreams come true so that audiences can see them and hear them and be part of them. I'd like to say that I think that we're on the eve of something that's going to make the Industrial Revolution look like a small-town tryout out of town. And I'm talking about the communications revolution. I think it's coming very quickly, and that the movies of the 80s are going to be amazing beyond what any of you can dream, just a couple of years away from now. And I see a communications revolution that is about movies and art and music and digital electronics and computers and satellites and above all human talent. And it's going to make things that the masters of the cinema, from whom we've inherited this business, wouldn't believe the things that are going to be possible.
It's as if he was talking about his future film, Megalopolis.
How interesting is that? It almost feels like a parallel to that. I also recently watched him in the Criterion Closet. If you haven't seen that YouTube video, it's amazing. He picks out one of his own films, which I just think is amazing. Like, what? Absolute goat. He picks out Rumblefish and is like, this is my favorite film of mine. He's amazing. Totally worth watching. And he talks, again, very profoundly about the future of film in a way that I thought was very interesting and almost parallels what he talked about in the speech that you just heard. And you may have heard that he sounded a little bit funky And recently, I think it was in 2023, he shared on Instagram a little bit more about why he was acting the way he was that night. He wrote, "A clip of my presentation of the Best Director Award at the 1979 Oscars. I took this moment to give my prediction of the upcoming, quote, communications revolution. Turns out I was right, but wrong about one thing. Not, unfortunately, these new capabilities weren't controlled by the filmmakers as I had hoped. So the films in the 1980s were not all amazing. My friend Bill Graham accompanied me to the 1979 Oscars, having always wanted to attend. As I got closer to the presentation, he was eating some cookies, and I was always hungry. I grabbed one and ate it, with Bill saying, 'Wait, no, no.' Then I was led down backstage with Ally McGraw and started feeling funny and began scratching my beard nervously." So clearly, the boy had a little funky special cookie, and I just absolutely love that. My boy was high for his award presentation. Like, only Francis Ford Coppola continues to be like the rebel of cinema, and I absolutely love it. And stay tuned for our top 10 movies of 2024, and maybe you'll hear us talk more about him.
Yeah, maybe. Just maybe. But yeah, I thought it was just a funny moment that, again, like watching, like, Coppola's stoned while saying this, then looking up, I'm like, oh, he actually was stoned while talking about this. It was really funny, but not take away from Cimino's accomplishment. Directing this movie was a hell of an effort and job. Seemed like, though, that there was a lot of issues with the actual production of the film, but he persevered, made a very, very good movie, despite being over budget with it. So, yeah, just fascinating guy. But moving on to the final category of the 51st Academy Awards, Best Picture. The nominees are An Unmarried Woman, Midnight Express, Heaven Can Wait, Coming Home, and our winner of the 51st Best Picture Winner Award goes to The Deer Hunter, to Barry Spikings, Michael Dealey, Michael Cimino, and John Peveril. Producers Spikings, Dealey, and Peveril had no prior Oscar nominations or wins. Cimino won, obviously, a category before for Best Director. And then presenting the award, this is the final public appearance of John Wayne, where he was given a standing ovation before presenting the award. And on June 11th of 79, 2 months after the ceremony, he died from complications from stomach cancer at the age of 72.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That's just about the only medicine a fella'd ever really need. Believe me when I tell you that I'm mighty pleased that I can amble down here tonight. Well, Oscar and I have something in common. Oscar first came to the Hollywood scene in 1928. So did I. We're both a little weather-beaten, but we're still here and plan to be around for a whole lot longer.
So a very special moment. These British producers and one New York Italian director winning the award, accomplishing a huge feat for a film that, again, reading a lot of like backstory to it, seemed like it was a kind of a huge effort to get it off the ground. A lot of like issues just going over budget, timing, scheduling, but they managed to make it work. So John, why don't we get into some stats and figures for The Deer Hunter, and then give our own ratings and answer that age-old question. So currently, The Deer Hunter has a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes with an average rating of 8.58. Top critics percentage is a 90 with an average out of 10 an 8.4. The audience score is a 92 with an average score of 4.33 out of 5. IMDb is an 8.1. So this is the 8th movie in a row, if I am looking at correctly, 7th or 8th movie in a row with an over an 8 on IMDb, which is pretty remarkable. Metacritic gives it an 86 though, and it won 5 total Oscars out of 9 nominations. John, what score did you give The Deer Hunter?
I gave The Deer Hunter an 85 out of 100. So for reference, I gave The Sting from 73 and 86. I gave French Connection in 84. And I gave West Side Story in 82 for some comparisons there. I thought The Deer Hunter was a very impactful, powerful movie. I thought it was very well done in terms of composing a 3-act structure of setting up this nuclear family, this kind of found family in Pennsylvania that struggles but is very communal with their experience of celebrating this wedding, going on these hunting trips, and then we watch their lives get kind of twisted and turned apart. And it was very powerful to see that, and we have just such amazing performances as we gushed about. I think the biggest issues I have with the film, I think it's definitely too long. I think the movie could have been 25 minutes shorter. I think the cinematography, while the differences between Vietnam, handheld, when it's on sticks, when it's at home, or in the third act when they come back home, I just felt that there could have been a lot more interesting aspects to the cinematography. I thought you could have pushed it a little bit more and added a little bit more style. I think when you look at something like The Godfather, there's a lot more style and what it feels like a lot more intention when it comes to the cinematography that this is lacking. I also feel like it definitely could have been tightened in a way that would have made the film more impactful. But those are only small issues I have with the film. Overall, I see the way it has kind of impacted film and film culture. I see the way we are now continuing to push boundaries in terms of violence, in terms of depictions of war, and the way the Academy is looking at those things as well. But it's also not too much of a difference between our history. We've seen the progression with All Quiet on the Western Front, the best years of our lives. So I gave The Deer Hunter an 85. Ben, what did you give The Deer Hunter?
So I went back and forth with what I originally had, this viewing. It had been a few years in between, viewings now at this point. So I brought it to an 89. I felt that this movie lacked in some of the areas that I thought I did enjoy the first time around, that this time I'm just like, yeah, this movie is a little too long. Like, yeah, this is just a little, that's like not enough, but it's so driven by the cast and the characters, not necessarily like the actual screenwriting, but more like the emotive aspects of their story. The story itself, I thought, was really good too. Like, I really did enjoy the story. I thought it shot beautifully. So I just thought it had all these great aspects to it, but it does get dragged down by the length of the film. And I think that all these different plot points that get brought up that are just never really resolved and having to infer a bunch. There's some, I think, amateurish decisions that Cimino makes that is just like, okay, like we didn't need to do that, and it could have easily been cut. So to me, it's an 89. So it sits below. It's like a B+ movie. It's solid. It really does get the job done. I think I could casually watch this movie, honestly, just put it on randomly and like just get into it at any moment. I think it's a very, very good movie. And again, like I think the acting is just so superb that it completely drives it. But I think it's just below like an A- enough, where it's just like, it's not one of the best of the best, but definitely better than some other ones. And I don't think it should be downplayed at all, that how good it is. It's just not, this doesn't do it to the level I think some other movies that we've seen have. So I really enjoyed it. So our average ratings right now, John, you're averaging through 51 movies watched, a 76.3, and I'm doing a 78.2. So sort of around the same. Had some movies again drag us down, but we'll see if we can bring those numbers up. So John, as we always try to answer these questions, and the big question is, The Deer Hunter worthy of the Best Picture Award of 1978?
Absolutely. Of course it is. I think when you look at these other nominations, of course, we haven't seen An Unmarried Woman or Coming Home because of availability. We'll have to catch those soon, hopefully. But we both watched Heaven Can Wait and Midnight Express. I thought that those were interesting movies. I thought Heaven Can Wait was a fun kind of dramedy comedy, maybe forward comedy, but it didn't really impact me that much. I felt like it was very dated compared to Midnight Express and The Deer Hunter. Midnight Express is good, but it is kind of all over the place, and it feels a little bit amateur at times, but it also feels forward thinking and modern in a lot of ways. But I think The Deer Hunter is a clear, obviously, winner, and it's truly worthy. Ben, what about you?
I agree. I think it's worthy. I think it's out of this year makes the most sense. I think it has a true message of talking about trauma, what our veterans go through of reintegrating back into society. It's a powerful movie. It looks beautiful. It does a lot, I think, to take a next step in the world of film. I think this movie looks completely sort of like On the Waterfront, where we talked about it feels like it's closer to what we see today. I think this did take the medium to another level and made it look, again, more modern. It looks like it fits within the world of films today. Again, as I was saying before, the acting is amazing. If the Best Cast award was around, it would have won that as well. It's a really, really good film. So I think it's worthy of the award. I liked Heaven Can Wait when I watched it. I thought that was actually a really cute Frank Capra-esque movie. But it felt be like, this wouldn't, I don't see it fitting in with other Best Picture winners. Same thing with Midnight Express. It's a very haunting movie. It was very good, but just didn't feel like that's a Best Picture winner. This film does. It's truly impactful. Speaking of that, as Nick is about to blow his brains out behind me on my screen. So very impactful, very beautiful and haunting film. And yeah, worthy of the Best Picture award of 1978.
Absolutely. I think we kind of bring this full circle and bring it back to our comparisons, All Quiet on the Western Front from 1930, Best Years of Our Lives from 46, and From Here to Eternity from 1953, covering some of these similar topics: war, PTSD, how it affects your community and loved ones. I personally think I prefer The Best Years of Our Lives. I gave that a much higher rating just because I think it's a more like perfect package in terms of telling that message. But The Deer Hunter is a profound film in the way it's kind of able to capture this spirit and the way America was kind of like ripped apart during this period. And it does in a way that I don't feel is very political, even though the ending is always debated whether it's political or not. But I still think the film is very profound, and it's going to stick around for a long, long time.
So yeah, that's I think that concludes our conversation on The Deer Hunter. John, is there any final thoughts? Anything that we didn't hit on or touch on with the film? You're too good to be true.
Take my eyes off of you. I'm like heaven to touch.
All right, I think that concludes it here. Thank you for listening. I'm Ben.
And I'm John. And this is Worthy.
You're just too good to be true. Can't take my eyes off of you. You'd be like heaven to touch. I wanna hold you so much. At long last, love has arrived, and I thank God I'm alive. You're just too good to be true. Can't take my eyes off of you. On the way that I see, there's nothing else to fear. Here I go.
There's no sense in getting too relaxed, buddy.
Please let me know that it's real. You're just too good to be true. Can't take my eyes off of you.
Thanks for listening to Worthy, the breakdown of every Best Picture winner from past to present. Listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on Instagram at Worthy Podcast, on Twitter at Worthy Pod, and on Facebook at Worthy Podcast. Any inquiries can be submitted to worthysubmissions@gmail.com. That's worthysubmissions@gmail.com.